The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Sarah Jenkins stepped out onto the porch of her cabin, inhaling deeply as the crisp Montana air filled her lungs. At 45, she had found a renewed sense of purpose in these early morning runs, a ritual that had become as essential to her writing process as her laptop and endless cups of coffee. Sarah stretched her lean muscles, feeling the familiar pull and release that signaled her body's readiness for the day ahead. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her running shoes, though well worn, were snug and comfortable on her feet. She glanced at her watch, 6:15 a.m. Perfect timing. As she stepped off the porch, the gravel crunched beneath her. Feet, a sound that always reminded her of how far she'd come from the busy streets of Chicago. 3 years ago, she had traded in her high-rise apartment and hectic city life for this rustic cabin near Flathead Lake. The transition hadn't been easy, but mornings like this made it all worthwhile. Another beautiful day, Sarah murmured to herself, her breath visible in the cool air. She began a light jog down the path that led from her cabin to the main trail, her muscles warming quickly despite the chill. The forest around her was coming to life. Birds chirped their morning songs, and occasionally she could hear the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was a symphony she had grown to love, so different from the cacophony of car horns and sirens that had once been her daily soundtrack. She reached the trailhead. Sarah paused for a moment, taking in the view. Flathead Lake sparkled in the distance, its surface like glass in the early morning light. She never tired of this sight, often using it as inspiration for her novels. "All right, Sarah," she said to herself, a habit she'd developed during her solitary life in the woods. "Let's see if we can beat yesterday's time." With that, she set off down the familiar trail, her feet finding their rhythm on the well-worn path. The forest closed in around her, the trees creating a natural tunnel that guided her way. Shafts of early morning sunlight broke through the canopy, dappling the ground with golden spots that seemed to dance as she passed. As she ran, Sarah's mind wandered to the novel she was currently working on. The protagonist, a wildlife photographer, was about to have a life-changing encounter with a rare species of bird. Sarah chuckled to herself, thinking how her own life had changed since moving here. She'd gone from writing about urban crime to crafting stories set in the wild, all because she'd taken a chance on a new beginning. Maybe I should have her meet a bear instead, Sarah mused aloud, her breath coming in steady pants now. Now that would be a story. She rounded a bend in the trail, her thoughts still on her fictional character. The trail widened slightly here, and Sarah knew she was about a mile into her run. She'd be turning back soon, making it home in time, for a shower and breakfast before settling in for a day of writing. Suddenly, a sound to her right made Sarah slow her pace. She cocked her head, listening intently. It wasn't unusual to hear animals in the forest, but something about this noise made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Hello?" she called out, immediately feeling foolish. If it was an animal, it wouldn't answer. And if it was a person, well, she wasn't sure which would be worse out here. The noise came again, a rustling of leaves followed by a low grunt. Sarah's heart began to race, and not from the exertion of her run. She knew the wildlife in these parts included bears, but in 3 years she'd never encountered one on her morning jogs. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, trying to remember the bear safety tips she'd learned. "Make yourself big, make noise, back away slowly." She raised her arms above her head, trying to appear larger than her 5'6" frame. "Hey, bear!" she shouted, her voice sounding thin and scared even to her own ears. "I'm just passing through, no need to bother with me." Sarah began to back away slowly, her eyes fixed on the spot where she'd heard the noise. Her heart was pounding so loudly in her ears that she almost missed the sound of heavy footfalls coming from behind her. She whirled around, her arms still raised, and found herself face to face with a massive black bear. It stood on all fours, its head lowered, and its eyes fixed directly on her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she took in the size of the animal. It was easily twice her weight, its black fur gleaming in the patchy sunlight. Time seemed to stand still as they regarded each other. Sarah's mind raced through everything she knew about bear encounters. Don't run. Don't turn your back. Try to appear non-threatening. "Easy there, big guy," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. I don't want any trouble. I'm just going to back away nice and slow." The bear huffed, a sound that seemed to reverberate through Sarah's entire body. She took a tentative step backward, then another. The bear watched her intently, but didn't move. "That's right," Sarah continued, hoping her voice might keep the bear at bay. "You stay there and I'll just be on my way. No need for either of us to have a bad day, right?" For a moment, it seemed to be working. The bear remained still, its eyes following Sarah's slow retreat. She allowed herself a glimmer of hope. Maybe this would just be an interesting story to tell, a close call that would add some authenticity to her writing. But then the wind shifted, carrying Sarah's scent directly to the bear. Its demeanor changed instantly. The bear's ears flattened against its head, and it let out a low, rumbling growl that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Oh no," she breathed, realizing with horrifying clarity what was about to happen. "No, no, no." The bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over Sarah. In that moment, she knew that her life was about to change forever. All thoughts of her novel, her peaceful morning run, her quiet life in the woods, vanished in an instant. There was only the bear, the trail, and the primal instinct to survive. As the bear dropped back to all fours and began to charge, Sarah did the one thing she knew she shouldn't do. She turned and ran, her feet pounding the earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of the bear crashing through the underbrush behind her spurred her on, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Help!" she screamed, knowing, even as she did so, that there was no one around to hear her. "Somebody help me!" But there was no help to be had. There was only Sarah, the bear, and the unforgiving wilderness around them. As she ran for her life, Sarah Jenkins realized that her morning routine had become a desperate fight for survival. Sarah's lungs burned as she tore through the forest, her feet barely touching the ground. The bear's huffing breath seemed to fill her ears, drowning out even the sound of her own ragged gasps. She dared not look back, knowing that every second counted. "Please, please, please," she chanted under her breath, a desperate prayer to whoever might be listening. Her mind raced, trying to remember anything that might help her survive this nightmare. Suddenly, her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a terrifying moment she couldn't breathe. As she struggled to her knees, a shadow fell over her. Slowly, Sarah raised her head. The bear loomed above her, its massive form blocking out the patchy sunlight filtering through the trees. Its dark eyes, usually so expressionless in the nature documentaries she'd watched, now seemed to burn with a primal intensity. Sarah could smell its musky odor, could see the saliva dripping from its open mouth. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Time seemed to slow down as she took in every detail of the creature before her, the texture of its fur, the curve of its claws, the steam rising from its breath in the cool morning air. The bear huffed, a sound that Sarah felt more than heard. It took a step closer, its head lowering as it assessed its prey. Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, but her body remained frozen in terror. "Nice bear," she said, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Good bear, you don't want to eat me. I'm all skin and bones, see? Not a good meal at all." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but its eyes remained fixed on her. Sarah slowly began to back away, her movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The bear didn't advance. Then, without warning, it charged. Sarah scrambled to her feet, adrenaline surging through her body. She ran blindly, no longer following the trail, simply trying to put distance between herself and the bear. Branches whipped at her face and arms, leaving stinging scratches, but she barely noticed. "Help!" she screamed again, her voice echoing through the trees. "Somebody help me." But there was no one to hear her cries. The forest, which had always seemed so peaceful and welcoming, now felt like a green prison, isolating her from any hope of rescue. As she ran, Sarah's mind raced through her options. Climb a tree. No, black bears were excellent climbers. Play dead? That was for grizzlies, not black bears. Fight back? With what? The sound of the bear's pursuit grew closer. Sarah could hear branches snapping under its weight, could almost feel its hot breath on the back of her neck. She knew she couldn't outrun it much longer. Ahead, she spotted a large fallen tree, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. Without thinking, she made a beeline for it. As she reached the log, she dove over it, tucking into a roll as she hit the ground on the other side. The bear, unable to stop its charges quickly, crashed into the log with a resounding thud. Sarah heard it grunt in surprise or pain. She couldn't tell which. Not wasting a moment, she scrambled to her feet and took off again. Her brief respite had given her a moment to orient herself. She recognized this part of the forest now. She wasn't far from a small stream she often passed on her longer runs. If she could reach it, maybe she could... What? She didn't know, but it was the only plan she had. Sarah pushed herself harder, ignoring the burning in her legs and the stitch in her side. She could hear the bear crashing through the underbrush behind her, having recovered from its collision with the log. It was gaining on her again. The trees began to thin, and Sarah could hear the faint sound of running water. Hope surged through her. She was almost there. Bursting through a stand of young pines, Sarah found herself on the bank of the stream. It wasn't very wide, maybe 15 feet across, but the water was moving swiftly over a bed of smooth rocks. Without hesitation, Sarah plunged into the stream. The icy water shocked her system, nearly causing her to gasp. The current was stronger than she expected, tugging at her legs as she waded across. Halfway across, she heard a splash behind her. Glancing back, she saw the bear enter the water, its powerful legs easily resisting the current that threatened to sweep Sarah off her feet. No, 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 Sarah muttered, pushing herself to move faster. Her foot slipped on a mossy rock, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought she would fall. Somehow she managed to keep her balance. As she reached the far bank, Sarah risked another look back. The bear was 3/4 of the way across the stream, its eyes still fixed on her with terrifying intensity. She clambered up the muddy bank, her shoes squelching with each step. The forest on this side of the stream was denser, the underbrush thicker. Sarah pushed through it, branches scratching at her arms and face. She had no idea where she was now, all sense of direction lost in her panic. Behind her, she heard the bear emerge from the stream, shaking itself with a sound like a wet dog. Then the crashing pursuit began again. Sarah's strength was failing. Her legs felt like lead, and each breath was a struggle. She knew she couldn't keep running much longer. As if to emphasize this point, her foot caught on a hidden root, sending her sprawling to the forest floor for the second time. This time, she couldn't find the strength to get up immediately. She rolled onto her back, gasping for air, and found herself staring up at the bear as it burst through the underbrush. The massive animal skidded to a stop, just feet from where Sarah lay. It rose up on its hind legs, towering over her. In that moment, Sarah was sure she was going to die. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom she was apologizing. To herself, for not being more careful. To the bear, for invading its territory. To the family and friends she'd left behind in Chicago, who would never know what happened to her. The bear dropped back to all fours, its head lowering as it approached Sarah. She could see every detail of its face now. The moisture on its black nose, the yellowed teeth, the intelligence in its dark eyes. As the bear's hot breath washed over her, Sarah closed her eyes. She thought of her cabin, of the book she'd never finish, of the life she'd built here in Montana. A strange calm settled over her. If this was how it ended, at least it would be in the wilderness she'd grown to love. The bear's growl rumbled through her, so close she could feel the vibration in her chest. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the pain she knew must come next, but it didn't. Instead, she heard a strange whooshing sound, followed by the bear's startled huff. Sarah's eyes flew open just in time to see the bear rear back, shaking its head violently. A red substance coated its face, and the air was filled with a pungent, spicy smell that made Sarah's eyes water. She blinked in confusion, her mind struggling to process what was happening. "Hey, get out of here, you big brute!" The shout came from somewhere to Sarah's left. She turned her head to see a figure emerging from the trees, waving its arms and yelling. The bear, still pawing at its face, let out a roar that was equal parts pain and frustration. It took a step back, then another. Sarah held her breath, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. With a final shake of its massive head, the bear turned and lumbered off into the forest, crashing through the underbrush as it retreated. Sarah lay there, her heart pounding, unable to comprehend that she was still alive. The figure that had scared off the bear approached, and as it drew closer, Sarah saw that it was a man in his 60s, dressed in hiking gear and holding a large can of what she now recognized as bear spray. "You okay there, miss?" the man asked, kneeling beside her. That was a close one. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she burst into tears, the full weight of what had just happened crashing down on her. As the adrenaline faded, she became aware of a searing pain across her back and a throbbing in her left wrist. "It's all right now," the man said gently, helping her to sit up. "You're safe. Let's get you out of here and take a look at those injuries. Can you walk?" Sarah nodded mutely, allowing the stranger to help her to her feet. As they began the slow journey out of the forest, Sarah cast one last glance over her shoulder. The bear was gone, but she knew the memory of this encounter would stay with her forever. The peaceful morning run that had started her day now seemed like a distant dream. In its place was a new reality, one where the beauty of the wilderness was tempered by its dangers. Sarah Jenkins had survived, but she knew she would never be the same. The stranger supported Sarah as they made their way through the dense forest. Every step sent waves of pain through her body, reminding her of the horrifying encounter she had just survived. The man, who had introduced himself as Frank, kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings, the can of bear spray still clutched tightly in his free hand. "Just a little further," Frank encouraged, his voice low and steady. "My truck's parked about a quarter-mile from here. We'll get you to the hospital in no time." Sarah nodded weakly, unable to find her voice. The adrenaline that had fueled her desperate flight was fading, leaving her exhausted and acutely aware of every ache and pain. Her back felt as if it were on fire, and her left wrist throbbed with each step. As they walked, Frank filled the silence with quiet conversation, perhaps sensing Sarah's need for distraction. "I've been hiking these trails for over 30 years, he said. "Seen my fair share of wildlife, but that was one of the closest calls I've witnessed. You're one lucky lady." Sarah managed a weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "If you hadn't come along," Frank shook his head. "No need to dwell on that. What matters is you're alive. Though I reckon you'll be investing in some bear spray of your own after this." The mention of bear spray triggered a memory in Sarah's fog-filled mind. How did you know to come?" she asked. Frank's weathered face creased into a grim smile. "Heard your screams," he said. "I was up on the ridge doing some bird watching. When I heard you, I came running. Good thing I always carry this with me." He lifted the can of bear spray. They walked in silence for a few more minutes, the forest gradually thinning around them. Finally, they emerged onto a narrow dirt road where an old pickup truck was parked. "Here we are," Frank said, helping Sarah into the passenger seat. "Let's get you to the hospital." The drive to the hospital was a blur for Sarah. The pain in her back and wrist had intensified, and she found herself drifting in and out of consciousness. Frank's voice, steady and reassuring, anchored her to reality. "Stay with me, Sarah," he urged. "We're almost there, just hold on a little longer." When they finally arrived at the small local hospital, everything happened in a whirlwind. Nurses rushed to help Sarah out of the truck and onto a gurney. Frank explained the situation to the staff as they wheeled her into the emergency room. "Bear attack," Sarah heard him say. "Lacerations on her back, possible fracture in her left wrist." The next few hours passed in a haze of examinations, x-rays, and treatments. Sarah answered the doctor's questions mechanically, her mind still struggling to process the morning's events. "You're very lucky, Miss Jenkins," the ER doctor said as he finished stitching up the claw marks on her back. "These lacerations are deep, but they missed anything vital. And your wrist is fractured, but it's a clean break. It should heal well with proper care." Sarah nodded, wincing as the doctor applied a bandage to her back. "When can I go home?" she asked. The doctor frowned. "We'd like to keep you overnight for observation. Bear attacks can be traumatic experiences, and we want to make sure there are no complications." As if on cue, a police officer and a park ranger entered the room. They introduced themselves as Officer Mike Donovan and Ranger Lisa Cortez. "Ms. Jenkins," Officer Donovan began, "we'd like to ask you a few questions about the attack if you're feeling up to it." Sarah nodded, and over the next hour, she recounted her harrowing experience. The officers listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "You said the bear was black?" Ranger Cortez asked. "Not brown." Sarah nodded. "Yes, definitely black. Is that important?" Ranger Cortez exchanged a glance with Officer Donovan. "It helps us identify the bear and assess the threat level to other hikers and campers in the area. Black bears are typically less aggressive than grizzlies, but they can be unpredictable, especially if they feel threatened or if it's a mother with cubs." "What will happen to the bear?" Sarah asked, surprised to find herself concerned for the animal that had nearly killed her. "We'll increase patrols in the area," Ranger Cortez explained. "If we can identify the specific bear, we may need to relocate it. But our primary concern right now is making sure you're okay and preventing any future incidents." As the interview concluded, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The events of the morning, which had started so normally, now seemed like a distant nightmare. "Get some rest, Ms. Jenkins," Officer Donovan said as they prepared to leave. "We'll be in touch if we need any additional information." Left alone in the hospital room, Sarah closed her eyes, hoping for sleep. But every time she drifted off, she saw the bear's dark eyes, felt its hot breath on her face. She jolted awake, her heart racing. A soft knock at the door roused her from her uneasy doze. It was Frank, the hiker who had saved her life. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, stepping into the room. "Just wanted to check how you're doing before I head home." Sarah managed a small smile. "I'm okay, thanks to you. I don't know how to thank you enough." Frank waved off her gratitude. "No need for thanks, anyone would have done the same. I'm just glad I was in the right place at the right time." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "Listen, I know this has been a terrible experience, but don't let it scare you away from the wilderness. Nature can be dangerous, yes, but it's also beautiful and healing. Just be prepared next time, okay?" Sarah nodded, touched by the old hiker's concern. As Frank turned to leave, she called out, "Frank, would you teach me about bear safety sometime? I think I need to learn more if I'm going to keep living out here." Frank's face broke into a wide grin. "It would be my pleasure, Sarah. You rest up now, and we'll talk when you're feeling better." As Frank left, Sarah settled back into her hospital bed. The pain in her back and wrist had dulled to a persistent ache, thanks to the medication. But the emotional wounds, she knew, would take longer to heal. She thought about her quiet life, in the cabin, her morning runs, the novel she had been working on. Everything had changed in the span of a few terrifying minutes. Yet, as she drifted off to sleep, Sarah realized that she didn't want to leave. This place, with all its beauty and danger, had become her home. The bear attack had shown her the brutal reality of life in the wilderness, but it had also revealed the kindness of strangers and the strength she didn't know she possessed. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would heal, she would learn, and she would not let fear drive her away from the life she had chosen. In her dreams, the bear returned, its dark eyes fixed upon her. But this time, Sarah stood her ground, no longer prey, but a woman who had faced nature's fury and survived. The wilderness had tested her, and though battered and bruised, Sarah Jenkins had emerged stronger. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sterile white of the hospital room, momentarily disoriented. As consciousness fully returned, so did the memories of the previous day's terrifying encounter. She winced as she tried to sit up, the movement pulling at the stitches on her back. A nurse entered the room, her cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to Sarah's somber mood. "Good morning, Miss Jenkins. How are we feeling today?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "I've been better," she replied, her voice still hoarse from yesterday's screaming. "But I suppose I should be grateful I'm feeling anything at all," the nurse nodded, sympathetically as she checked Sarah's vitals. "You've been through quite an ordeal. The doctor will be in shortly to check on you and discuss your discharge." As promised, the doctor arrived a short while later. He carefully examined Sarah's injuries, paying particular attention to the claw marks on her back and her fractured wrist. "The lacerations are deep, but they're clean," he explained. "We'll need to keep a close eye on them to prevent infection. As for your wrist, we'll put it in a cast today. You'll need to wear it for about 6 weeks." Sarah nodded, trying to absorb the information. "When can I go home?" she asked. The doctor hesitated. "Physically, you're stable enough to be discharged. Today? However, I'm concerned about the psychological impact of your experience. Have you considered speaking with a counselor? Sarah shook her head. I don't think that's necessary. I just want to go home and put this behind me. The doctor looked skeptical but didn't push the issue. All right, but I want you to promise you'll call if you experience any unusual symptoms, physical or emotional. Bear attacks can be traumatic, and it's not uncommon for survivors to experience anxiety or PTSD. After the doctor left, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. She stared out the window at the mountains in the distance, the same mountains that had nearly claimed her life. A part of her longed for the safety of her old life in Chicago, where the most dangerous thing she encountered was rush hour traffic. But a larger part, a part that surprised her with its intensity, rebelled against the idea of leaving. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. To her surprise, it was Ranger Lisa Cortez. "Ms. Jenkins," the ranger greeted her. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to check on you and provide an update on our investigation." Sarah gestured for her to enter. "Please call me Sarah, and it's—" "No intrusion. Have you found the bear?" Ranger Cortez shook her head. "Not yet. We've increased patrols in the area and set up some trail cameras. We're hoping to identify the bear and assess whether relocation might be necessary." Sarah frowned. "Relocation? You mean you won't kill it?" "That's always a last resort," Ranger Cortez explained. "We try to avoid it whenever possible. Bears are a vital part of our ecosystem here. What happened to you was terrible, but from what you've told us, it seems the bear was likely just as frightened as you were." Sarah nodded slowly, remembering the fear she'd seen in the bear's eyes. "I understand. I don't want it killed. It was just being a bear, I suppose." Ranger Cortez smiled approvingly. "That's a very mature perspective, Sarah. Many people in your position would be calling for blood." "Speaking of which, how are you holding up?" Sarah sighed. "Physically, I'll heal. Emotionally, I'm not sure yet. A part of me is terrified at the thought of going back into those woods. But another part, I don't know. I feel like if I let this drive me away, I'll be losing something important." The ranger nodded understandingly. "That's a common feeling among survivors of wildlife encounters. Listen, we offer wilderness safety courses at the ranger station. They cover everything, from bear safety to first aid. If you're interested, I think it might help you feel more prepared and confident." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Actually, that sounds perfect. The hiker who saved me, Frank, he offered to teach me about bear safety. Maybe he could come too." "Frank Malone?" Ranger Cortez asked. When Sarah nodded, she smiled. "Frank's forgotten more about these woods than most of us will ever know. He'd be a great mentor. I'll make sure he's invited to our next course." As Ranger Cortez prepared to leave, Sarah called out, "Ranger, thank you for everything." The ranger smiled warmly. "That's what we're here for, Sarah. Take care of yourself and we'll see you soon." After Ranger Cortez left, a nurse arrived to help Sarah prepare for discharge. As she changed out of the hospital gown, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked different somehow, older perhaps, but also stronger. The claw marks on her back, angry red lines that would undoubtedly scar, seemed less like wounds and more like a badge of survival. As Sarah signed her discharge papers, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, certainly. She knew the memory of the bear's hot breath and razor-sharp claws would haunt her for a long time. But there was something else too, a determination she hadn't felt before. She had faced one of nature's most fearsome predators and lived to tell the tale. What else was she capable of? The drive back to her cabin was a quiet one. Sarah had called a local taxi service, not feeling up to driving herself just yet. As they wound through the familiar roads, the forests that had seemed so inviting just days ago now looked ominous and foreboding. Sarah forced herself to take deep breaths, remembering what Ranger Cortez had said about the bear being as frightened as she was. When they finally arrived at her cabin, Sarah stood for a long moment on the porch, looking out at the trees. The urge to pack up and flee back to the city was strong. But as she turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, she felt a sense of homecoming that surprised her. Her laptop sat on the desk where she'd left it, the document of her unfinished novel, still open. Sarah ran her fingers over the keys, thinking about the protagonist of her story. A wildlife photographer who was about to have a life-changing encounter. She chuckled humorlessly. Life imitating art, or perhaps the other way around. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her living room, Sarah made a decision. She opened a new document on her laptop and began to type. The bear's eyes met mine, and in that moment, I understood something fundamental about life in the wilderness. We were not so different, this creature and I, both of us fighting for survival in a world that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. The words flowed easily, spilling out onto the page as Sarah recounted her harrowing experience. It was therapeutic in a way she hadn't expected, allowing her to process the fear and adrenaline of the attack. As she wrote late into the night, Sarah realized that this was more than just a cathartic exercise. It was the beginning of a new story, her story. A tale of survival, of facing fears, of finding strength in the most unexpected places. She glanced out the window at the dark forest beyond. The bear was out there somewhere, going about its bear life. And here she was, forever changed but not broken. Sarah Jenkins, bear attack survivor, turned back to her laptop and continued to write. The wilderness had tried to break her, but instead it had given her the story of a lifetime. The days following Sarah's return home were a mix of physical recovery and emotional turbulence. The pain from her injuries served as a constant reminder of her brush with death, while nightmares plagued her sleep. Despite this, Sarah found herself drawn back to her writing with a newfound intensity. One morning, about a week after the attack, Sarah sat at her desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen, waiting for words that wouldn't come. She sighed, rubbing her eyes tiredly. "Come on, Sarah," she muttered to herself. "You can do this, it's just words on a page." But it wasn't just words. It was reliving the most terrifying moment of her life, over and over again. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear's face, felt its hot breath on her skin. A knock at the door startled her out of her reverie. Sarah tensed, her heart rate spiking. Even though she knew it was irrational, a part of her feared it might be the bear, come to finish what it started. "Sarah, it's Frank. You in there?" Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Coming," she called, making her way to the door. Frank stood on her porch, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw her. "Hey there, survivor. Thought I'd check in on you. How you holding up?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "I'm managing. Come on in." As they settled in her living room, Frank's eyes swept over her, taking in the bags under her eyes and the way she favored her injured wrist. "You look like you haven't been sleeping much," he observed. Sarah shrugged, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing wounds. "Nightmares," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there in the woods, face to face with the bear." Frank nodded sympathetically. "That's normal, you know. After my first close call with a grizzly, I didn't sleep right for weeks." Sarah's eyes widened. "You've been attacked by a bear before." "Attacked? No. But I've had my share of close encounters," Frank replied. "That's part of why I wanted to stop by. I brought you something." He reached into his bag and pulled out a canister of bear spray, along with a book titled Living with Bears, A Practical Guide to Bear Country. "First rule of living in bear country," Frank said, handing her the items. "Always be prepared." Sarah took the bear spray, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than she expected. I don't know if I'm ready to go back out there," she admitted softly. Frank leaned forward, his expression serious. "Listen, Sarah. What happened to you was terrifying, no doubt about it. But you can't let fear keep you prisoner in your own home. These woods, they're your home now. You've got to learn to live with all aspects of it, bears included." Sarah nodded slowly, knowing he was right but still feeling the tendrils of fear curling in her stomach. "How do I do that?" "Well, that's where this comes in," Frank said, tapping the book. "Knowledge is power, Sarah. The more you understand about bears, their behavior, their habits, their motivations, the less frightening they become." Over the next few hours, Frank walked Sarah through the basics of bear safety. He explained the difference between black bears and grizzlies, taught her how to properly use bear spray, and gave her tips on how to avoid attracting bears to her property. As they talked, Sarah found herself becoming more engaged. She asked questions, took notes, and even laughed at some of Frank's more colorful anecdotes about his encounters with wildlife. "You know," Sarah said, as their impromptu lesson wound down, "I've been trying to write about the attack, but I've been struggling. Talking about it like this, it helps." Frank smiled. "Writing can be good therapy, but sometimes you need to talk it out with someone who understands. Have you thought about joining a support group?" Sarah shook her head. "I didn't even know there were support groups for bear attack survivors." "Oh yeah," Frank nodded. "There's a group that meets in town every month. Folks who've had close encounters with all sorts of wildlife. You might find it helpful." As Frank prepared to leave, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Frank, for saving my life, for this," she gestured to the bear spray and book, "for everything." Frank waved off her thanks. "That's what neighbors are for out here. We look out for each other." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah. You survived. Now it's time to start living again." After Frank left, Sarah returned to her desk. She looked at her laptop, the cursor, still blinking on the blank page. But now, instead of fear, she felt a spark of determination. She began to type. "The bear's eyes met mine, and in that moment, I understood something fundamental about life in the wilderness. We were not so different, this creature and I, both of us fighting for survival in a world that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure." The words flowed more easily now, fueled by her conversation with Frank and her newfound knowledge. She wrote about the attack, yes, but also about the beauty of the forest, the kindness of strangers, and the strength she was discovering within herself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her living room, Sarah paused in her writing. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. The trees that had seemed so menacing now looked different. Still wild and unpredictable, yes, but also familiar. Home. Sarah picked up the can of bear spray, feeling its weight in her hand. Then, with a deep breath, she opened her front door and stepped out onto the porch. The cool evening air carried the scent of pine and earth. In the distance, a bird called out, its song echoing through the trees. For the first time since the attack, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fear was still there, a low hum in the back of her mind, but it no longer paralyzed her. She had survived the worst the wilderness could throw at her. She had looked death in the eye and lived to tell the tale. As she stood there, watching, the last light fade from the sky, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow she would go for a walk. Not a long one, and not on her old running trail, but a walk nonetheless. Because this was her home now, bears and all, and she refused to be a prisoner of fear. Sarah turned and went back inside, closing the door behind her. She returned to her desk, where her story waited. But now, as she began to type again, it was no longer just a recounting of a traumatic event. It was becoming something more, a testament to resilience, a love letter to the wild, and a promise to herself. Sarah Jenkins, bear attack survivor and wilderness dweller, had found her voice, and she had a story to tell. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of birdsong filtering through her open window. For a moment she lay still, savoring the peaceful sounds of the forest. Then, with a deep breath, she sat up, wincing slightly as her healing wounds protested the movement. "Today's the day," she murmured to herself, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. As she dressed, Sarah's eyes fell on the can of bear spray Frank had given her. She picked it up, its weight now familiar in her hand, and clipped it to her belt. The action felt like a small victory. After a light breakfast, Sarah stood at her front door, hand on the knob. Her heart raced, but not entirely from fear. There was anticipation there too, and a determination she hadn't felt since before the attack. "You can do this," she told herself firmly. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sarah took a deep breath, letting the familiar smells wash over her. She scanned the tree line, alert but not panicked. No bears in sight, just the gentle sway of branches in the morning breeze. Sarah set off down a small path that led away from her cabin, different from her usual running trail. She had chosen this route carefully. It was wider, with better visibility, and closer to other cabins in the area. Small steps, she reminded herself. As she walked, Sarah found her writer's mind kicking into gear. She noticed details she'd overlooked before, the intricate patterns of lichen on tree trunks, the way sunlight dappled the forest floor, the chorus of unseen birds in the canopy above. Her fingers itched for a notebook. About 15 minutes. Into her walk, Sarah heard a rustling in the underbrush to her right. She froze, her hand instinctively going to the bear spray at her hip. Her heart pounded as she scanned the area, remembering Frank's lessons. Make yourself big. Make noise. Stand your ground, hey bear, Sarah called out, her voice stronger than she expected. I'm just passing through. The rustling continued for a moment. Then a small red fox emerged from the bushes. It regarded Sarah with curious eyes before darting across the path and disappearing into the forest on the other side. Sarah let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through her. Not quite a bear, huh? She said to the empty air. As her heartbeat slowed, Sarah realized something. Yes, she had been scared, but she hadn't panicked. She had remembered her training had stood her ground. Progress, she thought with a small smile. Encouraged, Sarah continued her walk. She found herself noticing more and more details, a cluster of vibrant wildflowers, the intricate construction of a spider's web, the distant sound of running water. Her writer's mind was fully engaged now, storing away images and sensations for later use. As she rounded a bend in the path, Sarah caught sight of a familiar figure up ahead. It was Frank, binoculars around his neck and a well-worn backpack on. His shoulders. Sarah, he called out, a broad smile spreading across his weathered face. Well, look at you. Out and about already? Sarah returned his smile, realizing she was genuinely happy to see him. Hi, Frank. Yeah, I decided it was time to stop hiding in my cabin. Frank nodded approvingly. That's the spirit. How are you feeling? Nervous, Sarah admitted, but also alive? Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Frank chuckled. Nothing. Like a brush with death to make you appreciate life, eh? Say, since you're out here, want to join me for a bit? I was just about to do some bird watching. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'd like that, actually. As they walked together, Frank pointed out various birds, teaching Sarah to identify them by sight and sound. She found herself relaxing in his company, the initial tension of the walk easing away. You know, Frank said as they paused to watch. A woodpecker at work. I'm proud of you, Sarah. Takes guts to get back out here after what you went through. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Thanks, Frank. I don't think I could have done it without your help. Frank waved off her gratitude. Nah, this was all you. I just gave you some tools. You're the one who decided to use them. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the forest a soothing backdrop. As they neared a small clearing, Frank suddenly held up a hand, signaling Sarah to stop. Look there, he whispered, pointing to the far side of the clearing. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her breath catch in her throat. There at the edge of the trees was a black bear. It was smaller than the one that had attacked her, possibly younger. The bear hadn't noticed them yet, busy foraging for berries. Sarah's first instinct was to run, but she forced herself to stay still, remembering her lessons. She gripped the bear spray tightly, her eyes never leaving the animal. Easy now, Frank murmured beside her. We're downwind and it hasn't seen us, just watch. And so they did. For several minutes, Sarah and Frank observed the bear as it went about its business, completely unaware of their presence. Despite her initial fear, Sarah found herself fascinated. The bear's movements were almost graceful, its powerful body moving with surprising agility as it searched for food. Beautiful, isn't it? Frank whispered. Sarah nodded, surprised to find she meant it. It is, she agreed softly. Eventually, the bear ambled back into the forest, disappearing from view. Only then did Sarah realize she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, feeling a mix of relief and something else. Awe, maybe? You did good, Sarah, Frank said, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. Kept your cool, didn't panic. That's half the battle right there. As they made their way back to the trail, Sarah found herself deep in thought. The bear she had just seen was so different from the one in her nightmares. It wasn't a monster, just an animal going about its day. The realization was oddly comforting. When they reached the point where their paths diverged, Frank turned to Sarah with a serious expression. Remember, Sarah, what we saw today was a bear behaving naturally. But never let your guard down out here. Respect the wildlife, stay prepared, and you'll be all right." Sarah nodded, taking his words to heart. "I will, Frank, and thank you for everything." As she walked back to her cabin, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. She had faced her fear head-on and come out the other side. The forest around her, which had seemed so threatening just days ago, now felt not safe, exactly, but familiar, like home. Back at her cabin, Sarah sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. The words came easily now, fueled by her experiences of the morning. She wrote about the fox, the birds, the wildflowers, and yes, the bear. But this time the bear wasn't a monster. It was simply part of the wilderness she had chosen to call home. As the sun began to set, Sarah looked out her window at the darkening forest. The fear wasn't gone entirely. She knew it might never be, but it no longer controlled her. She had taken back her life, one step at a time. Sarah Jenkins, bear attack survivor and wilderness dweller, smiled to herself and continued to write. She had found her story, and more importantly, she had found her strength. As the days passed, Sarah found herself settling back into a routine, albeit a modified one. Her morning runs had been replaced by leisurely walks, always with bear spray at her hip and a newfound awareness of her surroundings. The forest, once a source of terror, was slowly becoming a place of refuge again. One crisp morning, about 3 weeks after the attack, Sarah sat at her desk, fingers flying across the keyboard. The story of her encounter with the bear had evolved into something more. A novel about survival, resilience, and the complex relationship between humans and nature. She was so engrossed in her writing that she almost missed the sound of tires crunching on the gravel outside. Curious, Sarah went to the window. A familiar truck was pulling up. It belonged to Ranger Lisa Cortez. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Had there been another bear attack? Or worse, had they found her bear? She opened the door before Ranger Cortez could knock. "Ranger Cortez, is everything okay?" The ranger smiled reassuringly. "Everything's fine, Sarah. I just wanted to check in on you and give you an update on our bear situation. May I come in?" Sarah nodded, ushering her inside. As they settled in the living room, Sarah noticed the ranger eyeing her healing wounds. "How are you feeling?" Ranger Cortez asked. "Better," Sarah replied honestly. "The physical pain is mostly gone, and I'm working through the rest." Ranger Cortez nodded approvingly. "That's good to hear. Frank mentioned you've been getting back out on the trails. That takes courage." Sarah felt a warmth at the ranger's words. "It's not easy," she admitted, "but it helps to remember what you said, that the bear was probably as scared as I was." "That's a healthy perspective," Ranger Cortez said. "Speaking of which, that's part of why I'm here. We've been monitoring bear activity in the area since your attack." Sarah leaned forward, her heart rate picking up. "And we believe we've identified the bear that attacked you," Ranger Cortez said carefully. "It's a young male, probably only 3 or 4 years old. We've spotted him on our trail cameras a few times." Sarah's mind raced. Part of her had hoped they'd never find the bear, that it would remain a faceless monster in her memory. But now, knowing it was young, possibly inexperienced, it changed things. What will happen to him?" Sarah asked, surprised by the concern in her own voice. Ranger Cortez seemed to approve of her question. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. Normally, in cases of unprovoked attacks, we'd consider euthanizing the bear. But given the circumstances of your encounter, you surprised each other on the trail, and the bear's young age, we're considering other options. Specifically, relocation." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Relocation? You mean move him to a different part of the forest?" "A different forest entirely," Ranger Cortez explained. "We'd move him to a more remote area, far from hiking trails and cabins. It would give him a chance to live out his life without further human interaction." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this information. "And you're telling me this because your input matters," Ranger Cortez said firmly. "You're the victim here, Sarah. If you're not comfortable with relocation, if you feel the bear is too dangerous to remain alive, we'll take that into serious consideration." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her mind whirling. She thought about the terror of the attack, the weeks of nightmares that followed, but she also thought about the bear she and Frank had observed in the clearing. Peaceful, majestic in its own way. I don't want him killed, Sarah said finally. What happened was horrible, but like you said, it was as much my fault as his. We surprised each other. If there's a chance he can live out his life peacefully somewhere else, I think that's the right thing to do. Ranger Cortez smiled warmly. I was hoping you'd say that. Your perspective on this has been remarkable, Sarah. Not everyone would be so understanding. As the ranger prepared to leave, a thought struck Sarah. Ranger Cortez, when you relocate him, could I be there? The ranger looked surprised. You want to be present for the relocation? Sarah nodded, a bit surprised herself. I think it might help. To see him one last time, to know that he's going somewhere safe, is that crazy? Not at all, Ranger Cortez assured her. It's actually quite common for attack survivors to want some kind of closure. If you're sure about this, I think we can arrange it. After Ranger Cortez left, Sarah sat at her desk staring out the window at the forest. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type. Instead, she found herself reflecting on the strange journey of the past few weeks. She thought about the bear, young, probably scared, now about to be moved from the only home it had ever known. In a way, their paths weren't so different. They had both been changed by their encounter, both forced to adapt to a new reality. With a sudden burst of inspiration, Sarah began to type. The words flowed easily, painting a picture not just of her own experience, but of the bear's as well. She wrote about fear and survival, about the delicate balance between humans and nature, about second chances. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her desk, Sarah sat back and read over what she had written. It wasn't just a story about a bear attack anymore. It was something more, a tale of two creatures, human and animal, navigating a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. Sarah smiled to herself, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She had come so far from that terrifying day on the trail. The scars on her back would always be a reminder of what had happened, but they no longer felt like a burden. They were a testament to her survival, to her strength, and now she had a chance to ensure that her bear, got a second chance too. It felt right somehow, a fitting end to a chapter of her life that had begun in terror but was ending in understanding and hope. As night fell, Sarah closed her laptop and walked out onto her porch. The forest stretched out before her, dark and mysterious. Somewhere out there, a young bear was going about its life, unaware that its fate was intertwined with hers. In a few days they would see each other one last time, and then their paths would diverge for good. Sarah took a deep breath of the cool night air, feeling more at peace than she had in weeks. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. She had faced her fears, found her strength, and rediscovered her love for this wild, unpredictable place she called home. With a small smile, Sarah turned and went back inside, leaving the porch light on, a beacon of warmth in the vast, dark forest. The day of the bear's relocation dawned clear and cool, a typical Montana morning. Sarah woke early, her stomach a knot of anticipation and nerves. She dressed carefully, choosing sturdy hiking boots and layers that would keep her warm in the crisp mountain air. As always, she clipped the canister of bear spray to her belt, a habit now, more than a precaution. A knock at her door signaled the arrival of Ranger Cortez. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Good morning, Sarah," the ranger greeted her with a reassuring smile. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to the relocation site was quiet, the silence broken only by Ranger Cortez's occasional updates on the procedure. They were heading to a remote area deep in the Flathead National Forest, far from hiking trails and human habitation. The bear was tranquilized early this morning, Ranger Cortez explained, as they bumped along a rough forest road. "He's been sedated and monitored by our wildlife biologists. We'll release him in an area with plenty of natural food sources and minimal human activity." As they approached the site, Sarah's heart began to race. A cluster of vehicles came into view: forest service trucks, a large animal transport van, and several official-looking SUVs. A group of people in various uniforms milled about, preparing equipment and conversing in low voices. Ranger Cortez parked and turned to Sarah. "Remember, you're here as an observer only. Stay close to me, and if at any point you feel overwhelmed, just say the word and we'll step away, okay?" Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. They exited the vehicle and approached the group. Sarah could feel curious eyes on her. Word had clearly spread about her presence. A tall man in a Forest Service uniform stepped forward, extending his hand. "Ms. Jenkins, I'm Dr. Alan Reeves, lead wildlife biologist for this operation. We appreciate you being here today." Sarah shook his hand, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "Thank you for allowing me to observe." Dr. Reeves nodded, his expression serious. "Before we proceed, I want to assure you that the bear is in excellent health. We've taken every precaution to ensure his safety during this relocation." A lump formed in Sarah's throat at his words. Despite everything, she found herself genuinely concerned for the animal's well-being. Can I see him?" she asked hesitantly. Dr. Reeves exchanged a glance with Ranger Cortez, who nodded her approval. "Of course, follow me." They approached the animal transport van, and Dr. Reeves carefully opened the rear doors. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she laid eyes on the sedated bear. He was smaller than she remembered, his black fur glossy in the morning light. A steady rise and fall of his chest indicated his deep, drug-induced sleep. Sarah was struck by how vulnerable he looked. Not the terrifying monster of her nightmares, but a wild animal, out of place in this world of humans and machines. "He's young," Dr. Reeves explained softly. "Probably only had one season on his own before your encounter. In his new home, he'll have a chance to grow, to live as a bear should, wild and free." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought of her own journey over the past weeks, the terror, the pain, the slow process of healing. In a strange way, she felt connected to this bear. They had both been changed by their encounter, both forced to adapt to a new reality. "It's time," Ranger Cortez said gently, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah stepped back, watching as the team of biologists and rangers prepared for the release. They carefully transferred the bear from the van to a large wheeled cage. Dr. Reeves administered a reversal agent for the sedative, explaining that the bear would slowly wake as they moved him to the release site. The group moved deeper into the forest, following a rough trail. Sarah walked alongside Ranger Cortez, her senses alert to every sound and movement in the woods around them. This was bear country, wild and untamed. Finally, they reached a small clearing. The team positioned the cage, its open end facing the dense forest beyond. Dr. Reeves turned to address the group. "The bear will be groggy when he wakes, but he'll instinctively seek cover. We'll back away to give him space, remember? Absolutely no noise or sudden movements." Sarah's heart pounded as she watched the bear in the cage. His breathing had changed, becoming less regular. A paw twitched. Then his head moved slightly. He was waking up. Time seemed to slow as the bear gradually regained consciousness. Sarah held her breath, acutely aware of every sound in the forest. The whisper of wind through the trees, the call of a distant bird, the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. Suddenly, the bear's eyes opened. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah found herself staring into those dark, intelligent eyes once again. But this time, there was no fear, no aggression, just a wild animal, confused and cautious. The bear struggled to its feet, swaying slightly, as it shook off the last effects of the sedative. It sniffed the air, taking in its new surroundings. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it lumbered out of the cage and into the forest. Sarah watched, transfixed, as the bear disappeared into the underbrush. A tangle of emotions washed over her, relief, sadness, and a surprising sense of closure. "He's gone," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Ranger Cortez squeezed her shoulder gently. "You did a good thing today, Sarah. You gave him a second chance." As the team packed up their equipment, Sarah remained at the edge of the clearing, her eyes fixed on the spot where the bear had vanished. She thought about the manuscript waiting on her laptop at home, the story of a woman and a bear, of fear and forgiveness, of the wild and untamed places that still existed in the world. "Ready to head back?" Ranger Cortez asked softly. Sarah nodded, taking one last look at the forest. Yeah, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. I'm ready. As they walked back to the vehicles, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The bear was gone, off to start a new life in a place where it could truly be wild, and she was, still here in the home she had chosen, stronger and wiser for the experience. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, the wind rustling through the trees. Sarah breathed deeply, taking it all in. This was her world now, beautiful, dangerous, and endlessly fascinating. She wouldn't have it any other way. In the days following the bear's relocation, Sarah found herself filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The experience had given her closure, but it had also ignited a spark of inspiration that she couldn't ignore. She spent long hours at her desk, fingers flying over the keyboard as she poured her story onto the page. One morning, as she sat sipping coffee on her porch watching the mist rise from the forest floor, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Ranger Cortez. "Good morning, Sarah," the ranger's voice came through clearly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Sarah replied, curious about the unexpected call. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Ranger Cortez assured her. "I'm actually calling because the local newspaper has reached out to us. They're doing a feature on wildlife, conservation in the area, and they've heard about your story. They're wondering if you'd be willing to give an interview." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't spoken publicly about her experience yet, beyond the initial report to the authorities. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. "An interview?" she repeated, buying time to gather her thoughts. "You don't have to decide right away," Ranger Cortez said quickly. "And if you're not comfortable, that's completely understandable. But I thought you might want to consider it. Your perspective on coexisting with wildlife, especially after what you've been through, could be really valuable." Sarah took a deep breath, considering the opportunity. She thought about her manuscript, about the message she was trying to convey through her writing. Maybe this was a chance to reach even more people. "Okay," she said finally, "I'll do it." The next day, Sarah found herself sitting across from Jack Peterson, a journalist from the local paper, the Flathead Gazette. They had agreed to meet at a small cafe in town, a neutral ground that felt less intimidating than inviting a stranger to her cabin. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview, Miss Jenkins," Jack said, setting up his recorder. "Your story has garnered quite a bit of interest in the community." Sarah nodded, trying to quell the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm happy to share my experience if it can help others understand the importance of wildlife conservation and safety. In bear country." Jack smiled encouragingly. "That's exactly what we're hoping to address, so let's start at the beginning. Can you tell me about the day of the attack?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount her story. She described her morning run, the sudden appearance of the bear, the terror of the chase and the attack itself. As she spoke, she found herself delving into the emotions she had experienced. The fear, yes, but also the profound respect for the power of nature that had grown out of her ordeal. "It was the most terrifying moment of my life," she admitted. "But looking back, I realize it was also a wake-up call. We live in their habitat, and we need to be prepared and respectful of that fact." Jack nodded, scribbling notes. "And how has this experience changed your view of wildlife, particularly bears?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "It's made me more cautious, certainly. I always carry bear spray now, and I'm much more aware of my surroundings when I'm in the forest. But it's also deepened my appreciation for these animals. They're not monsters or mindless killing machines. They're complex creatures trying to survive, just like us." The interview continued, covering Sarah's recovery, her decision to stay in Montana, and her involvement in the bear's relocation. Jack seemed particularly interested in her perspective on the relocation process. "You actually witnessed the bear being released into its new habitat," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "That must have been an incredible experience." Sarah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. It was transformative. Seeing the bear, the same animal that had attacked me, looking so vulnerable, and then watching it disappear into the wild. It gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. As the interview wound down, Jack asked one final question. "What message would you like to share with our readers about living in bear country?" Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts. "I would say, Respect the wild. Take precautions. Educate yourself about bear safety, but don't let fear keep you from experiencing the beauty of nature. We're fortunate to live in a place where we can coexist with these magnificent creatures. It's up to us to do so responsibly. After the interview, Sarah walked back to her cabin, mulling over the conversation. She hoped her words would help others understand the delicate balance between humans and wildlife in this rugged landscape. Few days later, the article was published. Sarah's story made the front page of the local section, complete with a photo of her standing at the edge of the forest near her cabin. The headline read, "From Victim to Advocate, Local Writer Shares. Bear Attack Story and Conservation Message." As she read through the article, Sarah felt a mix of emotions. There was a hint of embarrassment at seeing her story laid out so publicly, but also a sense of pride. Her words about respect for wildlife and the importance of conservation were prominently featured. Throughout the day, her phone buzzed with messages from friends and neighbors who had read the article. Many expressed admiration for her courage, both in surviving the attack and in sharing her story, but it was an email from an unexpected source that truly touched her. Dr. Reeves, the wildlife biologist who had overseen the bear's relocation, had written to her, "Dear Ms. Jenkins, I wanted to reach out after reading your interview in the Gazette. Your perspective on wildlife conservation and coexistence is exactly what we need more of in this community. Your ability to turn such a traumatic experience into a positive message is truly admirable. I'm writing to ask if you would consider speaking at our upcoming wildlife education seminar. Your story could be incredibly impactful for both locals and tourists learning about bear safety and conservation. Please let me know if this is something you might be interested in. Best regards, Dr. Alan Reeves." Sarah read the email twice, a warmth spreading through her chest. She had never considered herself an advocate or a public speaker, but the idea appealed to her. It felt like a natural extension of the story she was trying to tell through her writing. As the sun began to set, Sarah stood on her porch, looking out at the forest. The trees were awash in the golden light of dusk, the shadows lengthening across the ground. Somewhere out there, bears were going about their lives, oblivious to the human debates and decisions that affected their world. Sarah took a deep breath of the pine-scented air and made her decision. She would accept Dr. Reeves's offer. If sharing her story could help foster a better understanding between humans and wildlife, then that was what she would do. She went back inside and began to compose her reply, feeling a sense of purpose that went beyond her writing. Sarah Jenkins, bear attack survivor, had found a new calling as a voice for the wild. The day of Dr. Reeves's wildlife education seminar arrived with a crisp autumn chill in the air. Sarah stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting her collar and taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, refining her story and researching bear behavior to supplement her personal experience. As she drove to the community center where the seminar was being held, Sarah's mind wandered to the journey that had brought her here. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had been attacked on that forest trail, yet the memories remained vivid. The scars on her back had faded to silvery lines, a permanent reminder of her encounter with the wild. The parking lot was already filling up when Sarah arrived. She recognized several faces from around town, as well as a few forest rangers in their distinctive uniforms. As she approached the entrance, she heard a familiar voice call out, "Sarah, glad you could make it." She turned to see Frank walking towards her, a warm smile on his weathered face. "Frank, I didn't know you'd be here," Sarah said, genuinely pleased. "To see her friend and mentor," he chuckled. "Wouldn't miss it for the world. It's not every day one of my students becomes the teacher." Inside, the community center hummed with activity. Dr. Reeves spotted Sarah and hurried over, his face a mix of relief and excitement. "Ms. Jenkins, thank you so much for coming. We have a full house today. Seems your story has really captured people's interest." Sarah nodded, trying to quell the butterflies in her stomach. "I just hope I can do it justice." As people settled into their seats, Dr. Reeves took the stage to introduce the seminar. He spoke about the importance of wildlife conservation and the challenges of human-wildlife coexistence. Then, with a warm smile, he turned to introduce Sarah. "And now I'd like to introduce someone who has a unique perspective on these issues. Sarah Jenkins is a local writer who survived a harrowing encounter with a black bear right here in our community. She's here to share her story and the insights she's gained. Please welcome Sarah Jenkins. The applause felt surreal as Sarah walked to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, curious, expectant, some even a bit wary. Taking a deep breath, she began, "Thank you, Dr. Reeves. Good morning, everyone. A few months ago, I went for a run in the woods behind my cabin just like I had done hundreds of times before. I never imagined that morning would change my life forever." As Sarah recounted her story, she could see the audience hanging on her every word. She described the terror of the attack, the pain of recovery, and the difficult decision to stay in bear country. But more than that, she spoke about what she had learned. That bear wasn't evil or malicious, she explained. It was just being a bear, a wild animal reacting to a perceived threat. In the weeks and months that followed, I had to confront my fears and misconceptions about these animals. I learned that coexistence is possible, but it requires respect, knowledge, and preparation. Sarah went on to share the practical lessons she had learned about bear safety, the importance of making noise on trails, properly storing food, and carrying bear spray. She talked about the bear's relocation and the complex issues surrounding wildlife management. As she neared the end of her talk, Sarah paused, looking out at the attentive faces before her. "I stand here today not just as a survivor, but as someone who has gained a deeper appreciation for the wild world around us. Yes, there are risks in sharing our space with wildlife, but there is also incredible beauty and value in preserving these animals and their habitats. It's up to all of us to learn, to prepare, and to coexist responsibly." The applause that followed was thunderous. As Sarah stepped back from the podium, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced her fears once again, not in the forest this time, but here in front of her community. After the seminar, people crowded around Sarah, eager to ask questions or share their own experiences. An older woman grasped her hand, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for your bravery," she said. "My grandson wants to go camping, but I've always been too afraid of bears. Your story has given me courage." A young ranger approached next. "Ms. Jenkins, your perspective is invaluable. Would you consider joining us for some of our public education programs in the future?" As the crowd thinned, Frank made his way to Sarah's side. "You did good, kid," he said, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You've come a long way from that scared woman I found in the woods." Sarah smiled, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Frank. You showed me it was possible to respect the wild without fearing it." As they walked out of the community center together, Sarah paused, looking up at the mountains in the distance. The late afternoon sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and pink, a stunning reminder of the natural beauty that surrounded them. "You know," she said softly, "I've been thinking about leading some writing retreats, combining my love for writing with wilderness education. What do you think?" Frank's face lit up. "I think that's a fantastic idea. You've got a gift, Sarah, not just for writing, but for helping people understand and appreciate nature." That evening, as Sarah sat on her porch watching the sun set behind the trees, she felt a profound sense of peace. The forest that had once been a source of terror now represented possibility and growth. She thought about the bear, hopefully thriving in its new home far from human habitation. In a strange way, that animal had set her on this new path. Sarah opened her laptop, fingers hovering over the keys. Her novel was nearly complete, a story of fear, survival, and ultimately coexistence. But she realized now that the story wouldn't end with the last page. It would continue with every person she reached, every mind she opened to a new perspective on wildlife. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah began to type. She had found her voice, her purpose. The words flowed easily, painting a picture of a world where humans and wildlife could coexist in mutual respect and understanding. It was a vision for the future, rooted in her own transformative experience. Sarah Jenkins, bear attack survivor turned wilderness advocate, smiled to herself as she wrote. The path ahead was clear and she was ready to walk it one step at a time. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. Emily Carter drummed her fingers on the steering wheel, her excitement palpable. as the SUV wound its way through the winding roads of Yellowstone National Park. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of pine trees, casting dappled shadows across the dashboard. Beside her, Jake Miller fiddled with the GPS, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Emily asked, glancing at the seemingly endless expanse of forest surrounding them. Jake looked up from the device, a reassuring smile spreading across his face. "Positive. Old Faithful Geyser Basin Campground should be just a few miles ahead. Trust me, I've got this." Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "That's what you said when we got lost hiking last month." "Hey, that trail was poorly marked," Jake protested, but his eyes twinkled with amusement. "Besides, getting a little lost is part of the adventure, right?" As they rounded a bend, the trees began to thin out, revealing glimpses of the sprawling campground ahead. Emily felt a surge of relief and anticipation. After months of planning and saving, their dream vacation was finally becoming a reality. "Kaandar." "It is," Jake exclaimed, pointing to a wooden sign marking the entrance to the campground. "Old Faithful, here we come." Emily navigated the SUV into the campground, following the winding dirt road past RVs and tents of various sizes. Families milled about, children's laughter mingling with the chirping of birds and the distant rumble of geothermal activity. "Look for Site 42, Jake reminded her, consulting the campground map they'd been given at the entrance. It should be near the edge of the campground, close to the hiking trails. After a few wrong turns and playful bickering over Jake's map reading skills, they finally found their designated spot. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with just enough space for their tent and a picnic table. A well-worn trail disappeared into the woods nearby, promising adventure for the following day. "Home sweet home for the next few days," Emily said, putting the car in park and killing the engine. She took a deep breath, savoring the crisp mountain air tinged with the scent of pine and distant sulfur. "I can't believe we're finally here." Jake leaned over and planted a quick kiss on her cheek. "Believe it, babe. Now let's get this campsite set up before it gets dark." They climbed out of the SUV, stretching their legs after the long drive from Seattle. Emily popped the trunk, revealing a Tetris-like arrangement of camping gear, their tent, sleeping, bags, cooler, and various other essentials they'd meticulously packed for the trip. "All right, divide and conquer," Jake suggested, already reaching for the tent bag. "I'll get started on our humble abode if you want to unpack the rest of the gear." Emily nodded, grabbing the cooler. "Sounds good. Just try not to tangle yourself." "Up in the tent poles this time." Jake feigned offense. "That was one time, and in my defense it was a very complicated tent." As Jake wrestled with the tent, Emily busied herself unpacking their supplies. She arranged their cooking gear on the picnic table, set up their camp chairs, and hung a small solar-powered lantern from a nearby tree branch. The sounds of the campground, distant conversations, the clang of pots and pans, and the occasional burst of laughter created a comforting background noise. "Hey, Em," Jake called from where he was struggling with a particularly stubborn tent pole. "Can you grab the mallet from the car? I think I need to reinforce these stakes." Emily rummaged through their gear, locating the small rubber mallet. As she handed it to Jake, she couldn't help but smile at his determined expression. Despite his occasional clumsiness, Jake's enthusiasm for outdoor adventures was one of the things she loved most about him. "Thanks," he said, accepting the mallet with a grin. "You know, I think I'm getting better at this whole tent pitching thing. We might actually have shelter tonight." Emily laughed, giving his shoulder a playful shove. "My hero. What would I do without you?" As the tent slowly took shape, Emily continued setting up the rest of their campsite. She unrolled their sleeping bags inside the tent, arranged their backpacks, and set out the ingredients for their dinner. The thought of grilled salmon made her mouth water. It had been Jake's idea to bring something a little fancier for their first night in the park. "Ta-da!" Jake exclaimed, stepping back from the now fully erected tent. "What do you think? Pretty impressive, right?" Emily walked over to inspect his handiwork. The tent stood tall and secure, its forest green fabric blending nicely with their surroundings. "Not bad, Miller. You might make a competent outdoorsman yet." Jake wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "High praise indeed. So, what's next on the agenda, future Mrs. Miller?" Emily leaned into him, savoring the moment. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the campground. In the distance, she could hear the faint rumble of Old Faithful preparing for its next eruption. Well, future Mr. Carter, she teased, using the joke they'd had since getting engaged. I think it's about time we start on that gourmet campfire dinner you promised me. I'm starving after all that unpacking. Jake's eyes lit up. Say no more. One wilderness. Feast coming right up. As Jake busied himself with setting up the portable grill, Emily took a moment to absorb their surroundings. The majestic pine trees towered above them, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. In the fading light, she could make out the silhouettes of distant mountains against the darkening sky. The air was filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and the faint sulfuric smell that permeated much of Yellowstone. It's beautiful here, she murmured, more to herself than to Jake. Jake looked up from where he was arranging charcoal in the grill. Did you say something? Emily shook her head, smiling. Just thinking out loud. I'm really glad we decided to do this trip. Jake straightened up, brushing his hands on his jeans. Me too. Although I still think we could have splurged for one of those fancy lodges with the hot tubs. Where's your sense of adventure? Emily teased. Besides, nothing beats sleeping under the stars. As the grill heated up, Emily and Jake worked together to prepare their dinner. They chatted about their plans for the next few days, hiking to see the geysers, wildlife watching in the Lamar Valley, and maybe even a guided horseback ride if they could squeeze it in. The sound of a branch snapping in the nearby woods made Emily pause, a shiver running down her spine despite the warm evening. She peered into the gathering darkness beyond their campsite but saw nothing. Did you hear that? She asked Jake, who was focused on seasoning the salmon fillets. Hear what? He replied, not looking up. Emily shook her head, trying to shake off the sudden unease that had settled over her. Nothing, I guess. Probably just a squirrel or something. As they continued preparing their meal, laughing and trading playful barbs, neither Emily nor Jake noticed the pair of gleaming eyes watching them from the shadowy undergrowth. The grizzly bear, drawn by the tantalizing smell of food, observed the oblivious couple with growing interest. For now it remained hidden, biding its time as the humans went about their evening routine, blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the warm circle of their campfire's light. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Emily and Jake settled into their campsite routine. The portable grill, a compact Coleman they'd splurged on for this trip, sat ready on the picnic table. Jake, ever the self-proclaimed grill master, was meticulously arranging the charcoal briquettes. You know, Emily said, rummaging through their cooler, when you said we'd be roughing it, I didn't expect a 3-course meal. Jake grinned, striking a match to light the charcoal. Hey, just because we're in the wilderness doesn't mean we can't. Eat like kings. Besides, I promised you a romantic dinner under the stars, didn't I? Emily chuckled, pulling out the vacuum-sealed salmon fillets they'd packed. Fair enough. Though I'm pretty sure most people's idea of camping involves hot dogs and s'mores. We're not most people, Jake winked, fanning the flames as they caught on the charcoal. Now hand me those fillets. It's time to work some magic. As Jake prepared the grill, Emily busied herself setting up their small camp table. She spread out a checkered tablecloth, a touch of home in the wilderness, and arranged their enameled plates and utensils. A battery-powered lantern cast a warm glow over their makeshift dining area. The sounds of the forest began to change. As night fell, the cheerful chirping of daytime birds gave way to the haunting calls of owls and the rhythmic chirping of crickets. In the distance, a coyote's howl echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. Did you hear that? She asked, glancing nervously at the darkening woods around them. Jake nodded, his expression reassuring. Just a coyote. They're more afraid of us than we are of them. Besides, we're safe here in the campground. Emily nodded, trying to shake off her unease. She focused instead on the delicious aroma beginning to waft from the grill as Jake laid the salmon fillets on the hot grates. So, Chef, she said, sidling up to Jake and peering over his shoulder, what's on the menu tonight? Besides this gourmet salmon? Jake gestured proudly to the spread he'd arranged on the picnic table. Well, my dear, We have cedar-planked salmon with a lemon dill glaze accompanied by foil packet roasted vegetables, and for dessert, campfire-baked cinnamon apples. Emily's eyes widened in mock surprise. Wow, you really went all out. I'm impressed. Only, the best for you, Jake said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Now how about you open that bottle of wine while I finish up here? As Emily uncorked the wine, a crisp Pinot Grigio they'd carefully packed for this occasion, she couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of their surroundings. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, twinkling brightly in the clear mountain sky. The distant hiss and rumble of geysers added an otherworldly soundtrack to the evening. Jake expertly flipped the salmon, the sizzle of flesh on hot metal mixing with the crackling of the charcoal. The rich, smoky aroma of grilling fish filled the air, making Emily's mouth water in anticipation. You know, she said, pouring wine into their camp mugs. I think this might be even better than that fancy restaurant you wanted to take me to. For our anniversary. Jake smiled, his face illuminated by the glow of the grill. See, I told you camping could be romantic. Just wait until you taste this salmon. As they waited for the food to finish cooking, Emily and Jake sipped their wine and chatted about their plans for the next day. They'd picked up a trail map at the visitor center and were debating which hike to tackle first. I still think we should do the Mystic Falls Trail, Jake said, gesturing with his mug. It's supposed to have amazing views of the geyser basin. Emily nodded, considering. True, but what about that one that goes up to the overlook? Observation Point, I think it was called? We could watch Old Faithful erupt from up there. Their discussion was interrupted by a rustling sound from the nearby bushes. Emily froze, her mug halfway to her lips. Jake, she whispered. Did you hear that? Jake paused, listening intently. The rustling came again, louder this time, accompanied by the snap of a twig. Probably just a deer, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emily's heart raced as she scanned the darkness beyond, their campsite. The lantern's glow, while comforting, made it hard to see into the surrounding forest. She could have sworn she saw a shadow move between the trees, larger than a deer should be. Maybe we should pack up the food, she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded slowly, reaching for the tongs to remove the salmon from the grill. Yeah, maybe you're right. Better safe than... His words were cut off by a loud snuffling sound, much closer this time. Emily gasped, stumbling backward and nearly knocking over her chair. Jake moved quickly, positioning himself between Emily and the direction of the noise. For a moment, everything was still. The only sounds were the sizzle of the grill and their own rapid breathing. Then, with a crash that seemed to shake the entire campsite, a massive form burst through the underbrush. Emily's scream caught in her throat as she found herself face to face with a grizzly bear. The animal was enormous, its shaggy brown fur glinting in the lantern light, its small eyes fixed intently on their dinner table. Jake reacted instinctively, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her towards the SUV. "Get in the car!" he shouted, fumbling for the keys in his pocket, but the bear, drawn by the irresistible smell of grilling salmon, paid them little attention. With one swipe of its massive paw, it sent the grill flying, scattering hot coals across the campsite. The salmon fillers disappeared into its mouth in 2 quick bites. Emily watched in horror as the bear turned its attention to their cooler, easily flipping the heavy plastic box and pouring at its contents. Jars shattered, and packets of food were strewn across the ground. "Jake," she whispered urgently, "what do we do?" Jake, his face pale in the lamplight, shook his head slightly. "Don't move," he murmured back. "Don't run. That'll just provoke it." They stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as the grizzly continued to ransack their campsite. It seemed to last an eternity, though in reality it was probably only a few minutes. The bear, having consumed everything edible in sight, finally turned its attention to them. Emily felt her heart stop as the grizzly's gaze locked onto hers. Its eyes, small and dark, held no malice, only a primal hunger and curiosity. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as human and bear regarded each other. Then, with a snort that sent shivers down Emily's spine, the bear turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily realized she'd been holding her breath and let it out in a shaky exhale. Beside her, Jake sagged with relief, his hand still gripping her arm tightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Emily nodded, unable to form words. Her legs felt weak and she sank to the ground, her whole body trembling. Jake knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her shaking form. "It's okay," he murmured, though his own voice quavered. "It's gone. Now we're safe." As the adrenaline began to ebb, Emily took in the destruction around them. Their carefully planned dinner was scattered across the campsite, the grill lay overturned and still smoking, and the contents of their cooler were strewn everywhere. "I think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that we might need to rethink our camping menu." Jake let out a shaky laugh, hugging her tighter. "Yeah, I think you might be right. How do you feel about plain oatmeal for the rest of the trip?" As they sat there, holding each other in the aftermath of their terrifying encounter, the sounds of the forest slowly returned. An owl hooted in the distance, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to mock the chaos of moments. Before Emily knew they would need to report the incident, clean up their campsite and figure out what to do about dinner. But for now she was content to sit in Jake's arms, listening to his heartbeat slowly return to normal, and marveling at the raw power of nature they had just witnessed. The romantic dinner under the stars hadn't gone quite as planned, but it was certainly a night they would never forget. The aftermath of the bear's visit left Emily and Jake in a state of stunned silence. The once orderly campsite now resembled a disaster zone, with overturned containers, scattered utensils, and the acrid smell of burned food hanging in the air. Emily's hands shook as she tried to process what had just happened. We should report this, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, we need to let the rangers know. But first, let's try to clean up a bit and make sure we're safe." They moved cautiously, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of the bear's return. Jake righted the fallen grill, wincing at the scorched grass beneath it. Emily gathered their strewn belongings, salvaging what she could from the ravaged cooler. "Most of our food is gone," she reported, holding up torn packages and crushed containers. "I think we have some granola bars and a bag of trail mix left in the car, though," Jake sighed, looking at the ruins of their gourmet dinner. "Well, so much for our romantic evening. How about a granola bar picnic instead?" Emily managed a weak smile. "Sounds perfect, as long as we're together, right?" As they munched on their makeshift dinner, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The forest around them, which had seemed so welcoming just hours ago, now felt ominous and unpredictable. "Do you think it'll come back?" Emily asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Jake wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I don't know, but we can't stay here tonight. It's not safe. Let's pack up what we can and drive to the ranger station. They'll know what to do." With renewed urgency, they began dismantling their campsite. The tent came down in record time, and they hastily shoved their belongings into the SUV. Every snapping twig and rustle of leaves made them jump, imagining the bear's return. As Jake secured the last of their gear, Emily stood by the car door, keys clutched tightly in her hand. The darkness of the forest seemed to press in around them, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Okay, I think that's everything," Jake said, slamming the trunk shut. "Let's get out of here." They climbed into the SUV, and Emily started the engine with trembling hands. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the devastation of their campsite one last time before they pulled away. The drive to the ranger station was tense and silent. Emily white-knuckled the steering wheel, her eyes darting between the road and the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the bear lumbering after them. "You're doing great, Em," Jake said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her knee. "We're almost there." The ranger station appeared ahead, a welcome sight with its warm lights and log cabin exterior. As they pulled into the parking lot, Emily let out a long, shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. A ranger emerged from the building as they got out of the car, likely alerted by the sound of their arrival. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a salt-and-pepper beard, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Everything all right, folks?" he asked, approaching them. "You look like you've had quite a night." Jake nodded, putting a protective arm around Emily. "We had an encounter at our campsite, a grizzly bear." The ranger's eyebrows shot up. A grizzly? Are you both okay? Any injuries? We're fine, Emily said, finding her voice. Just shaken up. It came into our campsite while we were cooking dinner. It ate our food and destroyed our sight, but it didn't attack us directly. The ranger nodded gravely. You're lucky. Grizzlies can be unpredictable, especially when food's involved. Come, on inside and we'll get a full report. I'm Ranger Mike, by the way. Inside the station, they sat at a worn wooden table while Ranger Mike prepared some coffee. The familiar smell and warm lighting helped calm Emily's frayed nerves. So, Ranger Mike said, setting steaming mugs in front of them, tell me exactly what happened. Jake recounted the evening's events, describing the bear's sudden appearance and its ransacking of their campsite. Emily chimed in with details, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. Ranger Mike listened intently, jotting notes on a pad. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. Sounds like a typical food-conditioned bear, he said. Unfortunately, we've been seeing more of this behavior lately. Visitors aren't always careful with their food storage, and the bears learn that campsites are an easy meal. Will it come back? Emily asked, voicing her biggest fear. Ranger Mike sighed. It's possible. Bears have excellent memories when it comes to food sources. That's why it's so important to use bear-proof containers and keep a clean campsite. Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. What should we have done differently? We thought we were being careful. From what you've told me, you didn't do anything wrong, Ranger Mike assured them. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, these encounters happen. That's the nature of sharing the wilderness with wild animals. He stood up, moving to a large map on the wall. I'm going to mark your campsite and report this incident. We'll send a team out in the morning to assess the area and see if we can identify the bear. Emily and Jake exchanged a glance. What happens if you do identify it? Emily asked hesitantly. Ranger Mike's expression turned somber. That depends on the bear's history and behavior. In some cases, if a bear becomes too habituated to human food and poses a significant risk, we may have to relocate or even euthanize. Emily felt a pang of guilt. Despite her fear, she didn't want the bear to be harmed because of their encounter. Is there anything we can do? Jake asked. To help prevent this from happening to someone else? Ranger Mike nodded approvingly. Education is key. Share your experience with other campers. Remind them about proper food storage and the importance of keeping a clean campsite. And if you're comfortable, we could use your account for our visitor education programs. As the conversation wound down, Emily felt the exhaustion of the evening catching up with her. What should we do now? She asked, stifling a yawn. Well, you can't go back to your campsite tonight, Ranger Mike said. We have some basic accommodations here at the station for emergencies like this. It's not fancy, but it's safe and bear-free. Jake squeezed Emily's hand. That sounds perfect, doesn't it, Em? Emily nodded gratefully. Thank you, Ranger Mike. We really appreciate your help. As Ranger Mike showed them to a small Spartan room with bunk beds, Emily felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Relief at being safe, lingering fear from their encounter, and a new respect for the wild nature of their surroundings. Try to get some rest, Ranger Mike said as he left them. We'll talk more in the morning about how to proceed with the rest of your trip. Alone in the room, Emily and Jake looked at each other, the events of the night reflected in their tired eyes. Some romantic getaway, huh? Jake said with a weak smile. Emily surprised herself by laughing. Well, it's certainly memorable. Although next time, maybe we stick to a nice bed and breakfast? As they settled into the narrow bunk beds, the sounds of the forest muffled by the station's sturdy walls, Emily found her mind drifting back to the moment she locked eyes with the grizzly. Despite her fear, she couldn't deny the raw beauty and power of the animal. It was a stark reminder that they were visitors in this wild place, not the other way around. Jake? She whispered into the darkness. Yeah? I'm glad you're here with me. She heard him shift in the bunk below. Me too, Em. We're in this together, bears and all. As Emily drifted off to sleep, the image of the grizzly's eyes stayed with her. It was a night she knew she would never forget, a brush with the wild heart of nature that would change her perspective forever. Despite the fear and disruption, she felt oddly grateful for the experience. It was, after all, the kind of adventure they had come to Yellowstone seeking, just not quite in the way they had expected. The morning sun filtered through the small window of the ranger station's guest room, rousing Emily from a fitful sleep. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a brief panic before the events of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up, rubbing her eyes and glancing down at Jake, who was still asleep in the lower bunk. "Jake," she whispered, reaching down to gently shake his shoulder. "Wake up, it's morning." Jake stirred, blinking up at her with bleary eyes. "Morning already, I feel like I just fell asleep." They dressed quickly and made their way to the station's small kitchen area, where they found Ranger Mike preparing coffee. The smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon filled the air, a comforting normalcy after the chaos of the night before. "Good morning, folks," Ranger Mike greeted them, his voice cheerful despite the early hour. "How'd you sleep?" "As well as could be expected," Emily replied, gratefully accepting a mug of steaming coffee. "Thank you again for letting us stay here." Ranger Mike waved off her thanks. "It's all part of the job. Now, let's talk about what comes next." Over a hearty breakfast of bacon, eggs, and toast, Ranger Mike outlined the plan for the day. A team had already been dispatched to their campsite to assess the situation and look for signs of the bear. "We'll need you to come with us to identify your belongings and give a more detailed statement," he explained. "After that, we'll need to decide whether it's safe for you to return to your campsite or if we need to relocate you." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "We'll do whatever you think is best, Ranger. We don't want to put ourselves or anyone else in danger." As they finished breakfast and prepared to head out, Emily felt a mix of anxiety and curiosity about returning to the scene of their encounter. The memory of the bear's sudden appearance was still vivid in her mind, but in the light of day, it seemed almost surreal. The drive back to their campsite was tense, with Emily and Jake both scanning the tree line for any sign of wildlife. Ranger Mike's truck led the way, its official Park Service logo a reassuring presence. When they arrived, Emily was struck by how ordinary the campsite looked in the daylight. If not for the scattered debris and overturned grill, it could have been any other morning in the park. A small team of rangers was already on site, photographing the area and collecting samples. Ranger Mike introduced them to the lead investigator, a petite woman with short gray hair and sharp eyes. "This is Ranger Sarah," he said. "She's our wildlife specialist. Sarah, these are Emily and Jake, the couple who had the encounter last night." Ranger Sarah shook their hands, her grip firm and reassuring. "I'm glad you're both okay. Bear encounters can be terrifying, but you did the right thing by staying calm and not running." As they walked through the campsite, Ranger Sarah pointed out various signs of the bear's visit: paw prints in the soft earth, claw marks on trees, and tufts of fur caught on branches. "Based on the size of the prints and the height of the claw marks, we're dealing with an adult male grizzly," she explained. "Probably around 600 pounds, give or take." Emily shuddered at the thought. The bear had seemed massive last night, but hearing its estimated size made the encounter seem even more harrowing. Jake, who had been quiet for most of the morning, suddenly spoke up. "Is there anything we can do to prevent this from happening again? To us or to someone else?" Ranger Sarah nodded approvingly. "Education is our best tool. We always encourage visitors to use bear-proof containers, keep a clean campsite, and make noise while hiking to avoid surprising bears. But sometimes, despite our best efforts, these encounters happen." As they continued to survey the damage, Emily noticed Jake becoming increasingly agitated. His jaw was set, and his eyes darted nervously around the clearing. "Jake," she said softly, touching his arm. "Are you okay?" He shook his head, his voice low and tense. "I just keep thinking about what could have happened. We were so unprepared, Em. What if it had attacked us instead of just going for the food?" Before Emily could respond, a loud crash echoed through the trees, causing everyone to freeze. For a heart-stopping moment, Emily was sure the bear had returned. Ranger Mike held up a hand, signaling for silence, as he and Ranger Sarah scanned the forest. The tension was palpable, everyone straining to hear any further sounds. Suddenly, Jake sprang into action. He grabbed a nearby camping shovel and brandished it like a weapon, positioning himself in front of Emily. "Jake, what are you doing?" Emily hissed, alarmed by his sudden movement. "I'm not letting that thing near you again," he growled, his knuckles white as he gripped the shovel. Ranger Sarah turned to them, her expression a mix of concern and warning. "Sir, please put down the shovel. If it is the bear, sudden movements and aggression will only provoke it." But Jake seemed beyond reason, his eyes wild with a combination of fear and determination. "I have to protect Emily," he insisted, his voice rising. "I won't let it hurt her." The Rangers exchanged worried glances. Ranger Mike slowly approached. "Jake," his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Jake, I know you're scared, but this isn't the way. You're putting yourself and Emily in more danger. Please, put down the shovel." Emily's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. She'd never seen Jake like this before, so consumed by fear and the need to protect her. It was both touching and terrifying. "Jake," she said softly, placing a hand on his trembling arm. "It's okay. We're safe. The Rangers are here to help us. You don't need to do this." For a moment, Jake remained tense, his gaze fixed on the tree line. Then slowly, the wild look in his eyes began to fade. His grip on the shovel loosened, and his shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, letting the shovel fall to the ground. "I don't know what came over me. I couldn't bear the thought of that thing coming back and hurting you." Ranger Sarah approached cautiously, her voice gentle but firm. "It's a natural reaction to want to protect the people we love, Jake. But in bear country, the best protection, there's knowledge and preparation, not confrontation." As the tension dissipated, another crash sounded from the forest, closer this time. Everyone held their breath, waiting. Then, to their collective relief, a young deer burst from the underbrush, startled by their presence. It bounded across the clearing and disappeared into the trees on the other side. The absurdity of the situation, their fear turned to relief by a skittish deer, broke the remaining tension. Nervous laughter rippled through the group, and Emily felt Jake relax beside her. Ranger Mike clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Why don't we take a break? I think we could all use a moment to catch our breath." As they walked back to the ranger's truck for some water and a chance to regroup, Emily slipped her hand into Jake's. He squeezed it tightly, a silent apology and reassurance. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Jake nodded, a rueful smile on his face. "Yeah, I think so. I'm sorry for freaking out like that. I felt so helpless last night. I wanted to be able to do something if it happened again." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "I know, but we're in this together, remember? We'll figure it out." As they rejoined the Rangers to continue the investigation, Emily felt a new respect for the delicate balance between humans and wildlife in places like Yellowstone. Their encounter with the bear had shaken them, but it had also opened their eyes to the raw beauty and power of nature. It was a reminder that they were visitors in this wild place, and that respect and caution were their best tools for coexistence. As the morning wore on, the Rangers continued their investigation of the campsite. Emily and Jake watched, a mix of fascination and lingering anxiety coloring their expressions. Ranger Sarah meticulously documented every piece of evidence, her practiced eye picking up details that Emily and Jake would have easily missed. "Look here," Ranger Sarah called, gesturing for them to come closer. She pointed to a series of deep gouges in the bark of a nearby pine tree. "These are fresh claw marks. Grizzlies often mark their territory this way." Emily shuddered, imagining the massive bear rearing up to leave its mark. "How high up do they go?" Ranger Sarah measured with her eyes. "About 8 feet. That's consistent with a large male grizzly." Jake whistled low. 8 feet? That's terrifying." As they continued to survey the area, Emily noticed Jake, becoming increasingly tense. His eyes darted around the clearing, and he stayed close to her, as if expecting the bear to burst from the trees at any moment. Ranger Mike, noticing Jake's unease, approached them. "How are you two holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily glanced at Jake before answering. "I think we're still processing everything. It's a lot to take in." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "I just can't stop thinking about what could have happened. We were so unprepared." Ranger Mike's expression was sympathetic. "That's a normal reaction. Bear encounters can be traumatic, even when they end as well as yours did. Would you like to take a break? We could head back to the station." "For a bit." Before they could answer, Ranger Sarah called out from the edge of the clearing. "Mike, come take a look at this." The group made their way over to where Ranger Sarah stood, crouched near a tangle of underbrush. As they approached, Emily's nose wrinkled at a pungent odor. "What is that smell?" she asked, covering her nose with her hand. Ranger Sarah looked up, a grim smile on her face. "Bear scat, and it's fresh." Jake tensed beside Emily, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. "How fresh?" he asked, his voice tight. "Within the last few hours," Ranger Sarah replied, standing up. "It's still moist and hasn't been disturbed by insects yet." The implication hung heavy in the air. The bear had been here recently. Perhaps it had even returned after their encounter last night. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The forest around them suddenly seemed more ominous, every shadow potentially hiding their nighttime visitor. "Does this mean it might come back?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Ranger Mike and Ranger Sarah exchanged a look. "It's possible," Ranger Mike admitted. "Bears are creatures of habit. If it found food here once, it might return hoping for more." Jake's grip on Emily's hand tightened. "Then we need to leave. Now, it's not safe here." Ranger Sarah held up a calming hand. "Let's not panic. Yes, the bear might return, but it's also possible it's moved on to other foraging grounds. What we need to do now is make this area less attractive to bears." She turned to Ranger Mike. "We should bring in a cleanup crew, remove all traces of food, secure the trash, maybe even use some deterrent sprays around the perimeter." As the Rangers discussed the next steps, Emily noticed Jake becoming more agitated. His breathing was shallow, and a fine sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Jake," she said softly, touching his arm. "Are you okay?" He shook his head, his eyes wild. "We can't stay here, Em. It's not safe. That thing could come back any minute. We need to go. Now." Before Emily could respond, Jake turned to the Rangers. "We're leaving," he announced, his voice shaky but determined. "Thank you for your help, but we can't stay here knowing that Bear might come back." Ranger Mike looked concerned. "I understand you're scared, Jake, but there's no need for hasty decisions. We have protocols in place for situations like this." But Jake was already moving, pulling Emily towards their SUV. "We'll pack up and go. Find a hotel or something. Anywhere but here." Emily stumbled after him, torn between understanding his fear and wanting to trust the Rangers' expertise. "Jake, wait. Maybe we should listen to what they have to say. They know how to handle these situations." Jake whirled to face her, his expression a mix of fear and frustration. "Don't you get it, Em? We could have died last night. That bear could have killed us both, and it might come back to try again. I won't put you in danger like that." His words hung in the air, raw with emotion. Emily saw the genuine fear in his eyes, the protective instinct that was driving him to act. Ranger Sarah approached cautiously. "Jake, Emily, I know this is scary. Believe me, I've been there. But running away isn't the answer. Let us help you understand what happened and how to prevent it in the future." Jake hesitated, clearly torn between his instinct to flee and the Ranger's calm logic. Emily took a deep breath, trying to find a middle ground. "Jake, honey, I'm scared too. But maybe we should listen to the experts. They deal with this all the time, right?" She turned to Ranger Sarah. "Could you tell us more about what we can do to stay safe and what are the chances of the bear actually coming back?" Ranger Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "Of course. Why don't we all sit down? I can walk you through our bear safety protocols and answer any questions you have." Slowly, reluctantly, Jake allowed himself to be led back to the Ranger's truck. They sat on the tailgate while Ranger Sarah brought out some informational pamphlets and a topographical map of the area. "First things first," she began. "It's important to understand that bears are generally not interested in humans as prey. Most encounters, like yours, are the result of bears being attracted to food or surprised by humans in their territory." She went on to explain the measures they could take to minimize the risk of another encounter. Proper food storage, making noise while hiking, carrying bear spray, and knowing how to react if they did see a bear again. As Ranger Sarah spoke, Emily felt some of the tension leave Jake's body. He listened intently, asking questions about bear behavior and the effectiveness of different deterrents. "And what about the bear that was here last night?" Jake asked, his voice calmer now. "Will it really come back?" Ranger Sarah considered the question. "It's possible, but not certain. Bears have large territories and don't usually stay in one. place for long unless there's a consistent food source. By cleaning up this area and using deterrents, we make it less likely that it will return. Emily squeezed Jake's hand. See? We can learn to coexist with the wildlife here. It's part of what makes this place so special, right? Jake nodded slowly, a hint of a smile finally breaking through his worried expression. Yeah, I guess you're right. I'm sorry for freaking out earlier. I felt so helpless last night. I wanted to be able to protect you if it happened again. Ranger Mike, who'd been quietly observing, spoke up. That's a natural reaction, Jake. But the best protection in bear country is knowledge and preparation. You two handled yourselves well last night, all things considered. With a little more information and the right precautions, you'll be well equipped to enjoy your time here safely. As the conversation continued, Emily felt the fear that had gripped them since last night slowly start to loosen its hold. Yes, the bear encounter had been terrifying, but it had also been a powerful reminder of the wild beauty that had drawn them to Yellowstone in the first place. She looked out at the forest around them, seeing it with new eyes. The trees that had seemed menacing earlier now stood tall and majestic. A breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. In the distance, a woodpecker's rhythmic tapping echoed through the woods. This was why they had come here, to experience nature in all its raw, untamed glory. The bear was a part of that, a reminder that they were visitors in a wild place. As scary as the encounter had been, Emily realized she didn't want to leave. She wanted to learn, to understand, to find a way to appreciate the beauty around them, while respecting the power of the wilderness. She turned to Jake, seeing a similar realization dawning in his eyes. "What do you think?" she asked softly. "Do you still want to leave?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze traveling from Emily to the rangers to the forest beyond. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice stronger now. "No, I don't want to leave. I want to learn how to do this right, how to be here safely, respectfully. If you're willing to stay, then I am too." Emily smiled, feeling a surge of love and admiration for Jake's courage. She turned to the rangers. "So where do we start?" Ranger Sarah grinned, clearly pleased by their decision. "Well, first things first, let's get this campsite bear-proofed. Then we'll go over some safety protocols for hiking and camping. By the time we're done, you two will be regular bear country experts." As they set to work, Emily felt a renewed sense of excitement for their adventure. Yes, there were risks, but with knowledge and respect they could navigate them. The bear encounter had shaken them, but it hadn't broken their spirit. Instead, it had opened their eyes to the true nature of the wilderness they had come to explore. And in that realization, Emily found a deeper appreciation for the beauty and power of Yellowstone. As the afternoon sun climbed higher in the sky, Emily and Jake found themselves immersed in a crash course on bear safety. Ranger Sarah, with her wealth of experience, had transformed their campsite into an outdoor classroom. The couple listened intently, their earlier fear gradually giving way to a mix of respect and cautious fascination for the wildlife they were sharing the park with. "Now, one of the most important things to remember," Ranger Sarah explained, holding up a canister, "is proper food storage. This here is a bear-resistant food container. It's not just about protecting your snacks, it's about keeping the bears wild and preventing them from associating humans with easy meals." Jake examined the canister closely, his brow furrowed in concentration. "How exactly does this work? It looks pretty sturdy, but surely a determined bear could still get into it." Ranger Sarah nodded approvingly at the question. "Good thinking. Jake, these canisters are designed to be bear-proof, not just bear-resistant. They're made of durable materials and have a locking mechanism that requires opposable thumbs to open. Bears are smart and strong, but they can't manipulate these locks." As she demonstrated how to use the canister, a distant car horn echoed through the trees. The sudden noise made Emily jump, her nerves still on edge from the previous night's encounter. Ranger Sarah noticed Emily's reaction and paused her explanation. "You okay there, Emily? Still a bit jumpy?" Emily nodded, embarrassed. "Yeah, I guess I am. Every little sound has me on edge, thinking it might be the bear coming back." "That's perfectly normal," Ranger Sarah reassured her. "But remember, bears are generally more afraid of us than we are of them. They prefer to avoid human contact when possible. Jake put a comforting arm around Emily's shoulders. We'll get through this together, Em. We're learning, right? Next time we hear a noise, we'll be prepared. Ranger Sarah smiled at their interaction. That's the spirit. Now, speaking of noises, let's talk about how to make your presence known while hiking. It's all about avoiding surprise encounters. She reached into her pack and pulled out a small bell. This is a bear bell. It attaches to your backpack or clothing and makes a constant tinkling sound as you walk. It lets bears know you're coming, giving them plenty of time to move away. Jake took the bell, giving it an experimental shake. Doesn't that get annoying? After a while, it can, Ranger Sarah admitted with a chuckle, but many hikers find it becomes white noise after a while. And trust me, it's a lot less annoying than stumbling upon a bear unawares. As they continued their lesson, the atmosphere in the campsite began to shift. The tension that had gripped Emily and Jake since the bear's visit started to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of empowerment. They were gaining knowledge, tools, and strategies to coexist safely with the wildlife around them. Ranger Sarah moved on to demonstrate proper bear spray usage, using a canister filled with water for practice. Remember, this is a last resort. Your first line of defense is always prevention and avoidance. But if you do find yourself in a close encounter, this can be a lifesaver. She showed them how to remove the safety clip and hold the canister correctly. You want to aim slightly downward and spray in a sweeping motion. The goal is to create a cloud of deterrent between you and the bear. Jake volunteered to try, his movements cautious but determined. As he went through the motions, Emily could see some of his earlier bravado returning, tempered now with respect and understanding. Nice job, Jake, Ranger Sarah praised. But remember, in a real situation, you'd need to be prepared to act quickly. Bears can move surprisingly fast when they want to. As the lesson progressed, Emily found herself becoming more engaged. She asked questions about bear behavior, habitat, and conservation efforts in the park. The more she learned, the more she realized how complex and fascinating these animals were. You know, she said during a break, I never thought I'd say this after last night, but I'm actually starting to appreciate bears more. They're not just mindless monsters, they're incredible animals trying to survive in their natural habitat. Ranger Sarah beamed at her words. That's exactly the kind of understanding we hope to foster here in Yellowstone. Bears are a vital part of this ecosystem, and learning to coexist with them is crucial for both their survival and our enjoyment of these wild spaces. As the afternoon wore on, Ranger Mike returned to the campsite with news. We've finished our sweep of the surrounding area, he reported. No fresh signs of bear activity beyond what we found earlier. I think it's safe for you folks to stay here tonight if you're comfortable with that. Emily and Jake exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. After a moment, Jake spoke up. What do you think, Em? Feel up to giving it another shot? Emily took a deep breath, considering. The fear from the previous night still lingered, but it was overshadowed now by a new sense of confidence and curiosity. I think I'd like to try. We came here for an adventure, right? This isn't quite what we had in mind, but it's certainly memorable. Jake grinned, squeezing her hand. That's my girl, always up for a challenge. Ranger Sarah looked pleased, but cautious. I'm glad to hear that. Your positive attitude will go a long way, but remember, this is still wild country. Stay alert, follow the safety protocols we've discussed, and don't hesitate to call for help if you need it. As the Rangers prepared to leave, Emily and Jake set about reorganizing their campsite with their newly acquired knowledge. They moved their tent farther from the tree line, set up the bear-resistant food container, and made sure all scented items were properly stored. Just as they were finishing up, a gust of wind brought a familiar scent wafting through the campsite, the unmistakable aroma of grilled meat. Emily froze, her mind flashing back to the previous night's terror. Jake noticed her reaction immediately. Em? What's wrong? That smell, she whispered, her voice tight. It's just like last night, when we were cooking the salmon. Realization dawned on Jake's face, followed quickly by concern. He turned to Ranger Sarah, who was packing up her demonstration materials. Is it safe for us to cook here? The smell is what attracted the bear last time. Ranger Sarah considered the question seriously. Good catch, both of you. Cooking odors can indeed attract bears. For tonight, I'd recommend sticking to cold meals, sandwiches, trail mix, things like that. When you do cook, try to do it well, away from your sleeping area, and store all food and cooking equipment in the bear canister immediately after use. Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of disappointment and relief. I guess our gourmet camping meals will have to wait for another trip. Jake chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Hey, peanut butter and jelly never tasted so good as when you're in the great outdoors, right? As the Rangers prepared to depart, leaving Emily and Jake to their renewed camping adventure, Ranger Sarah offered some final words of encouragement. Remember, you two have already faced one of the most challenging situations a camper can encounter in bear country. You handled it well, and now you're even better prepared. Trust your instincts, follow the safety guidelines, and don't forget to enjoy the beauty around you. That's what Yellowstone is all about. With final waves and promises to check in the following morning, the Rangers drove off, leaving Emily and Jake alone in their campsite once more. The forest around them seemed different now, still wild and unpredictable, but no longer menacing. Instead, it felt alive with possibility and hidden wonders. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Emily and Jake sat side by side at their picnic table, simple sandwiches in hand. The sounds of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, and the distant burble of a stream created a peaceful backdrop to their meal. You know, Jake said between bites, this isn't exactly the romantic dinner I had planned for our first night in Yellowstone. Emily laughed, bumping her shoulder against his. Maybe not, but I'd say it's pretty perfect in its own way. We're here, we're together, and we've already got one heck of a story to tell when we get home. As twilight settled over the campsite, Emily and Jake prepared for their second night in Yellowstone. This time, instead of fear, they felt a mix of excitement and respectful caution. They had faced their fears, gained new knowledge, and deepened their appreciation for the wild beauty around them. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to explore. But for now, as they settled into their tent, the soft glow of their lantern casting comforting shadows, Emily and Jake felt at peace. They had found their place in this wild landscape, not as conquerors, but as humble visitors, ready to learn from and appreciate the natural world in all its untamed glory. The night passed uneventfully, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous evening. As dawn broke over Yellowstone, Emily stirred in her sleeping bag, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the past day came rushing back, and she instinctively tensed, listening for any sounds of danger. But all she heard was the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze and the melodious calls of early rising birds. Beside her, Jake slept peacefully, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been since their encounter with the bear. Emily carefully unzipped her sleeping bag and crawled out of the tent, eager to see their campsite in the fresh light of day. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. As she stood there, taking in the beauty of the forest around them, a twig snapped nearby. Emily's heart leaped into her throat, her newfound peace instantly shattered. She whirled around, eyes wide, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Hey, whoa, it's just me, Jake's voice came from behind her. He had emerged from the tent, his hair tousled from sleep. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. Emily let out a shaky laugh, her hand pressed to her chest. It's okay, I guess I'm still a little jumpy. Jake wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Can't blame you for that. How are you feeling this morning? She leaned into his embrace, considering the question. Better, I think. It's so beautiful. Out here in the daylight, makes last night feel almost like a bad dream. They stood together for a moment, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The forest was coming alive around them, small animals scurrying about their morning routines, oblivious to the human drama that had unfolded in their midst. What do you say we get some breakfast going? Jake suggested. I don't know about you, but I'm starving. Emily nodded, her stomach growling in agreement. Sounds good. Let's just maybe eat away from the campsite. You know, like Ranger Sarah suggested. They gathered their food and cooking supplies, carefully removing them from the bear-resistant container. As they walked to a nearby clearing, Emily found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Jake noticed her unease. "You okay, Em? We can go back if you're not comfortable." She shook her head, determined. "No, I'm fine. We can't let fear control us, right? That's what the Rangers said. We just need to be smart and prepared." They set up their small camping stove in the clearing, the smell of coffee soon mingling with the fresh morning air. As Jake prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and dried fruit, Emily kept watch, the bear spray close at hand. "You know," Jake said as they ate, "I've been thinking about what Ranger Sarah said yesterday, about bears being a vital part of the ecosystem here." Emily nodded, encouraging him to continue. "It's just, I've always thought of bears as these dangerous predators, you know? But they're just trying to survive like any other animal. Maybe if we understood them better, encounters like ours wouldn't be so terrifying." As they discussed this new perspective, a rustling in the nearby bushes caught their attention. Emily froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Jake tensed, his hand inching towards the bear spray. Suddenly, a small fox darted out of the underbrush, its red coat gleaming in the morning. "Son." It paused for a moment, regarding them with curious eyes before disappearing back into the forest. The tension broke, and they both burst into laughter. "Well," Emily said, wiping tears from her eyes, "I guess we're not the only ones looking. Fair breakfast out here." As they finished their meal and packed up their supplies, Emily felt a shift in her perception. The forest, which had seemed so menacing the night before, now felt alive with possibility. Every rustle and movement was a reminder of the rich tapestry of life that surrounded them. They made their way back to the campsite, discussing their plans for the day. Despite their lingering nervousness, both Emily and Jake were eager to explore more of Yellowstone's wonders. "I was thinking we could try that hike to Observation Point," Emily suggested. "The one we were talking about before." "Well, you know," Jake nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds perfect. We can put all our new bear safety knowledge to the test." As they prepared for their hike, meticulously following the ranger's instructions for food storage and personal safety, a park service vehicle pulled up to their campsite. Ranger Mike stepped out, a friendly smile on his face. "Good morning, folks. Just thought I'd check in and see how your night went." Emily and Jake greeted him warmly, recounting their uneventful night and peaceful morning. "That's great to hear," Ranger Mike said, visibly relieved. "I know yesterday was tough, but it looks like you two are handling it well. Any plans for today?" They shared their intention to hike to Observation Point, and Ranger Mike nodded approvingly. "Excellent choice. The views up there are spectacular. Just remember everything we talked about yesterday. Make noise on the trail, stay alert, and keep your bear spray accessible." As Ranger Mike prepared to leave, he paused, his expression turning serious. "One more thing. We've had reports of increased bear activity in the area north of here. Nothing dangerous, just more sightings than usual. Might be a good idea to stick to the southern trails for now." Emily felt a flicker of anxiety at this news, but Jake squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Thanks for the heads up, Ranger Mike. We'll be careful." As the ranger's vehicle disappeared down the road, Emily and Jake finished packing their day packs. They double-checked their supplies: water, trail mix, first aid kit, and of course the bear spray prominently attached to their belts. Standing at the trailhead, Emily took a deep breath. The path ahead disappeared into the lush forest, promising adventure and breathtaking views, but it also held the unknown, the possibility of another encounter with the wild inhabitants of Yellowstone. Jake sensed her hesitation. "You ready for this, Em? We can always choose an easier trail if you're not comfortable." Emily considered for a moment, then squared her shoulders. "No, I'm ready. We came here for an adventure, right? Besides, after what we've been through, I think we can handle a little hike." With a shared smile of determination, they set off down the trail. As they walked, they made sure to chat loudly and clip their bear bells to their packs, the cheerful tinkling sound announcing their presence to any wildlife in the area. The hike was invigorating. The trail wound through dense forests and open meadows, each turn revealing new vistas of Yellowstone's stunning landscape. Despite their initial nervousness, Emily and Jake found themselves relaxing, caught up in the beauty of their surroundings. They stopped for a water break in a small clearing, the midday sun warm on their faces. As Emily took a sip from her water bottle, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to look. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a massive grizzly bear. It was upright on its hind legs, its nose in the air, clearly having caught their scent. Time seemed to stand still as Emily and Jake locked eyes with the magnificent creature. In that moment, all their training from the day before came rushing back. Moving slowly and deliberately, Jake unclipped the bear spray from his belt. Emily began to speak in a calm, firm voice, just as Ranger Sarah had taught them. "Hey, bear, we see you. We're just passing through. No need to worry about us." The bear dropped to all fours, its head swiveling towards them. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was the moment of truth, the test of everything they had learned. As they stood their ground, continuing to speak calmly to the bear, a gust of wind blew through the clearing. The bear's nose twitched, and to Emily and Jake's immense relief, it seemed to lose interest. With one last look in their direction, the grizzly ambled back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. For a long moment, Emily and Jake stood frozen, scarcely daring to breathe. Then, as the realization of what had just happened washed over them, they turned to each other, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Did that really just happen?" Emily whispered, her voice shaky but filled with awe. Jake nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It did, and we handled it. Just like the Rangers taught us." As the adrenaline began to subside, Emily felt a surge of pride and accomplishment. They had faced their fear head-on and come through it stronger. The bear, which had been the source of so much terror just a day before, had now become a powerful reminder of the raw beauty and majesty of the wilderness. With renewed energy and a deepened respect for the wild world around them, Emily and Jake continued their hike. The encounter, rather than ruining their trip, had somehow enriched it, providing a profound connection to the untamed heart of Yellowstone. As they reached Observation Point, the breathtaking view of Old Faithful and the surrounding geyser basin spread out before them. Emily realized that this trip had become so much more than a simple vacation. It was a journey of growth, of pushing boundaries, and of finding their place in the grand tapestry of nature. Hand in hand, they stood at the viewpoint, forever changed by their experiences in this wild and beautiful place. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, Emily and Jake made their way back to the ranger station. Their encounter with the grizzly bear on the trail had left them shaken but exhilarated, and they felt compelled to report the incident to the park authorities. The walk back was filled with animated discussion, reliving every moment of their face-to-face meeting with one of Yellowstone's most iconic and feared residents. "I still can't believe how calm you were," Jake said, shaking his head in admiration. "When I saw that bear, I thought my heart was going to explode." Emily laughed, a hint of nervousness still evident in her voice. "Believe me, I was terrified. But it's like everything Ranger Sarah told us just kicked in automatically. I heard her voice in my head, telling me what to do." As they approached the ranger station, they saw Ranger Mike outside, chatting with a group of hikers. He noticed them and waved, excusing himself from the conversation to meet them. "Well, if it isn't our bear country experts," he greeted them with a smile. "How was the hike to Observation Point?" Jake and Emily exchanged glances, unsure of how to begin. "It was eventful," Jake finally said. Ranger Mike's expression turned serious. "Eventful how? Did something happen?" Emily nodded, taking a deep breath before launching into their story. She described the clearing where they had stopped for a break, the sudden appearance of the grizzly, and how they had managed to stay calm and follow the safety protocols they had learned. As she spoke, Ranger Mike's eyebrows rose higher and higher. When she finished, he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be. You two certainly don't do things by halves, do you? Are you both okay?" Jake nodded, his arm around Emily's shoulders. "We're fine. A bit shaken up, but honestly, it was kind of amazing. Once we realized we weren't in immediate danger, it was just awe-inspiring to see such a magnificent animal up close." Ranger Mike smiled, clearly pleased with their attitude. "That's exactly the kind of perspective we hope visitors will gain. Now let's go inside and file a formal report." We like to keep track of all bear encounters, especially when they involve our overnight guests. Inside the station, they were met by Ranger Sarah, who listened to their story with rapt attention. As Emily described how they had remained calm and spoken to the bear, Sarah nodded approvingly. "You did everything right," she said, jotting notes on a form. "Staying calm, making your presence known, not running, that's textbook perfect behavior. I'm impressed that you were able to put it all into practice so soon after learning it." Jake shrugged, a hint of pride in his voice. "We had good teachers, and honestly, after what happened at our campsite, we were determined to be prepared for anything." As Ranger Sarah finished filling out the report, she looked up at them with a serious expression. "You know, not everyone would have reacted as well as you did. Some people might have decided to cut their trip short after an experience like that. How are you feeling about staying?" Emily and Jake exchanged glances, having a silent conversation. After a moment, Emily spoke. "Honestly, we want to stay. Hey, it's been scary, sure, but it's also been incredible. We feel like we're really experiencing Yellowstone, not just visiting it." Ranger Mike beamed at them. "That's what we like to hear. Now, given this encounter, we should discuss your plans for the rest of your stay. We might want to suggest some alternative trails, just to be on the safe side." For the next hour, they pored over maps of the park, with the rangers pointing out areas of heightened bear activity and suggesting routes that would still give them the full Yellowstone experience while minimizing the risk of further close encounters. As they wrapped up their discussion, Ranger Sarah pulled out a small card. "Before you go, I wanted to give you this. It's got the contact information for our wildlife education program. Given your experience and your positive attitude, we think you'd be great candidates to share your story with other visitors. It could really help people understand how to coexist with the wildlife here." Emily took the card, feeling a surge of excitement. "We'd love that. This whole experience has given us a new perspective on wildlife conservation. If we can help others understand these animals better, we're all for it." As they prepared to leave the station, Ranger Mike stopped them. "One more thing, I know you two have been through a lot and you've handled it admirably, but don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything, even if it's just to talk. Encounters like these can have a delayed impact, emotionally speaking." Jake nodded gratefully. "Thanks, we appreciate that. We'll definitely keep it in mind." Stepping out of the ranger station, Emily and Jake found themselves in a Yellowstone that looked different from the one they had entered just days ago. The forest was the same, the mountains unchanged, but their perception had shifted dramatically. "You know," Emily said as they walked back to their campsite, "when we planned this trip, I thought the highlight would be seeing Old Faithful, or maybe spotting some elk. I never imagined we'd have a story like this to tell." Jake chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Yeah, it's not exactly the romantic getaway we had in mind, but honestly, I wouldn't change it for anything." As they reached their campsite, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The beauty of it struck Emily, anew now tinged with a deeper appreciation for the wild heart beating beneath Yellowstone's scenic surface. They set about preparing their dinner, this time choosing a spot well away from their sleeping area, just as they had been taught. As they ate, they found themselves discussing not just their plans for the remainder of their trip, but also how this experience might change their approach to nature and wildlife in the future. "I'm thinking," Jake said between bites, "that maybe we should look into some wildlife conservation volunteer opportunities when we get back home. This trip has made me realize how important it is to protect these wild spaces and the animals that live in them." Emily nodded enthusiastically. "I was thinking the same thing, and maybe we could organize a fundraiser or something for bear conservation efforts. I bet our friends would be interested once they hear our story." As night fell, they sat by their campfire, the flames casting a warm glow over their faces. The forest around them was alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But now, instead of fear, these sounds brought a sense of connection to the natural world. "Hey, Em," Jake said softly, gazing into the fire. "Yeah? Thanks for not letting me run away when things got scary. This trip, it's changed me, changed us. I think we'll look back on this as a turning point in our lives." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented smile on her face. "I think you're right. Who knew that a terrifying bear encounter would end up being the best thing to happen to us?" As they prepared for bed, securing their food in the bear-resistant container and doing a final check of their campsite, Emily and Jake felt a sense of accomplishment and purpose. They had faced their fears, gained new knowledge and skills, and deepened their connection to each other and to the natural world. Tomorrow would bring new adventures in Yellowstone, but whatever challenges they might face, they knew they were ready. They had found their place in this wild landscape, not as conquerors, but as respectful visitors, eager to learn, explore, and protect the magnificent wilderness around them. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows across Emily and Jake's campsite. They had risen early, eager to make the most of their final day in Yellowstone. As they packed up their gear, there was a newfound efficiency in their movements, a confidence born from their experiences over the past few days. "I can't believe it's our last day already," Emily mused, carefully rolling up her sleeping bag. "It feels like we've been here for weeks, doesn't it?" Jake nodded, securing their food into the bear-resistant container. "I know what you mean. We've packed a lifetime of experiences into just a few days." As they finished breaking camp, they heard the familiar sound of a park vehicle approaching. Ranger Mike pulled up, a friendly smile on his face as he stepped out to greet them. "Good morning, you two. Just thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing after yesterday's excitement." Emily and Jake exchanged glances, both breaking into grins. "We're doing great, actually," Jake replied. "Still a bit wired from the encounter, but in a good way, you know?" Ranger Mike nodded approvingly. "That's good to hear. Many visitors might have packed up and left after an experience like yours." "I'm glad to see you're made of sterner stuff," Emily laughed, a touch of pride in her voice. "Well, we had some pretty good teachers. Everything you and Ranger Sarah taught us really came through when we needed it. Speaking of which," Jake added, "we were wondering if there might be a way for us to share our story with other visitors. You know, to help them understand how to stay safe in bear country." Ranger Mike's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "As a matter of fact, we're having a visitor education session at the main lodge this afternoon. It's mostly about general park safety, but I think your bear encounter story would be a perfect addition. Would you be interested in speaking?" Emily and Jake looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. After a moment, Emily nodded. "We'd love to. If our experience can help someone else stay safe, we're all for it." "Excellent," Ranger Mike beamed. "The session starts at 2 p.m. Why don't you enjoy your morning and then head over to the lodge around 1:30? I'll let the team know you'll be joining us." As Ranger Mike drove away, Emily and Jake finished packing up their campsite. There was a spring in their step as they hit the trail for one last hike, their senses alert, but no longer clouded by fear. The hike was uneventful, but beautiful. They spotted a herd of elk in a distant meadow and watched a bald eagle soar overhead. Every sight and sound of the forest seemed more vivid, more precious, knowing it was their last day in the park. As they approached a clearing, Jake suddenly held up a hand, signaling Emily to stop. "Look," he whispered, pointing to a fallen log at the edge of the clearing. There, not 20 yards away, sat a black bear. It was smaller than the grizzly they had encountered, its fur a glossy black in the midday sun. The bear was busy investigating, the log likely searching for insects. Emily felt her heart rate quicken, but not with fear. Instead, she felt a surge of excitement and respect. They stood silently watching the bear go about its business, neither human nor animal showing any sign of distress at the other's presence. After a few minutes, the bear ambled off into the undergrowth, leaving Emily and Jake with broad smiles on their faces. "Now that," Jake said as they resumed their hike, "is how I always imagined wildlife encounters would be. Peaceful, you know." Emily nodded, squeezing his hand. "It's amazing how different it feels now. Just a few days ago, we would have been terrified. Now it's like we're part of this whole ecosystem, not just visitors." They made it back to their car with plenty of time to spare before the education session. As they drove to the main lodge, they discussed what they wanted to share with the other visitors. The lodge was bustling with activity when they arrived. Ranger Mike met them at the entrance, ushering them into a large conference room where about 50 visitors were already seated. "Folks," Ranger Mike addressed the crowd, "before we get started with our regular safety briefing, I'd like to introduce Emily and Jake. They've had a rather eventful stay here in Yellowstone, and they've kindly agreed to share their experience with you all. Emily felt a flutter of nervousness as they stepped up to the front of the room, but it dissipated as soon as she began speaking. She recounted their first night in the park, the terror of the bear ransacking their campsite, and their initial desire to flee. Jake then took over, describing their decision to stay and learn, the valuable lessons they received from the rangers, and their face-to-face encounter with the grizzly on the trail. The most important thing we learned, Emily concluded, is that respect and knowledge are your best tools out there. The bears aren't out to get you. They're just trying to survive in their home. If we can understand that and act accordingly, we can coexist safely. The room erupted in applause as they finished their story. Visitors crowded around them afterward, peppering them with questions about their experience and asking for tips on staying safe. As the session wound down, Ranger Sarah approached them, a proud smile on her face. "That was fantastic, you two. You've probably done more to promote bear safety in the last hour than I have all week." Emily blushed at the praise. "We just wanted to share what we learned. If it helps even one person have a safer, more positive experience here, it's worth it." As they left the lodge, the sun was beginning to set on their Yellowstone adventure. They drove back to their campsite one last time to collect the last of their belongings before heading out of the park. Standing at the spot where their tent had been, where just days ago they had faced their greatest fear, Emily and Jake took a moment to reflect. "You know," Jake said, his arm around Emily's waist, "when we planned this trip, I thought it would be a nice little vacation. I never imagined it would change us like this." Emily nodded, leaning into him. "I know what you mean. It's like we're leaving as different people than when we arrived." As they drove towards the park exit, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness at leaving. "We'll come back," Jake said, as if reading her thoughts. "And next time, we'll be even better prepared." Emily smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Definitely, but you know what? As scary as it was at times, I wouldn't change a thing about this trip. It's been transformative." As they passed through the park gates, leaving Yellowstone behind, they carried with them not just memories, but a newfound respect for the wild, a deeper connection to nature, and a determination to share their experience with others. Their bear encounter, which had started as a nightmare, had become the catalyst for personal growth and a renewed commitment to conservation. As they drove into the gathering darkness heading home, Emily and Jake knew that this was not the end of their Yellowstone story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. 2 weeks after their return from Yellowstone, Emily sat at her desk in their Seattle apartment, staring at her computer screen. The cursor blinked steadily at the top of a blank document, waiting for her to begin typing. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then began to write. "Our Yellowstone adventure, a close encounter with the wild." As her fingers flew across the keyboard, Emily found herself reliving every moment of their trip. The initial excitement of arriving at the park, the terror of the first bear encounter, the lessons learned from the rangers, and the transformative experience of facing their fears head-on. She wrote about the beauty of the landscape, the thrill of hiking through bear country, and the profound respect they had gained for the wild inhabitants of Yellowstone. Jake came home from work to find Emily still engrossed in her writing. He quietly set a cup of tea beside her and peered over her shoulder. "The blog post?" he asked softly, not wanting to break her concentration. Emily nodded, pausing to take a sip of tea. "Yeah, I think I'm almost done. Want to take a look?" Jake pulled up a chair and began to read. As he did, a smile spread across his face. This is fantastic. You've really captured the essence of our experience." Emily beamed at the praise. "Thanks. I wanted to make sure I got everything down while it was still fresh in my mind. Do you think other hikers and campers will find it helpful?" "Absolutely," Jake assured her. "I think a lot of people could benefit from hearing about our experience. It might help them approach their own wilderness adventures with more respect and preparation." As Emily put the finishing touches on her post, Jake's phone buzzed with a notification. He checked it and his eyes widened in surprise. "Hey, Em, you might want to see this," he said, handing her the phone. It was an email from Ranger Sarah. The subject line read, "Your Yellowstone story, a teaching opportunity." Emily quickly opened the email and read it aloud. "Dear Emily and Jake, I hope this email finds you well, and that you've had time to process your incredible experience here in Yellowstone. Your story has made quite an impression on our team, and we've been discussing ways to incorporate it into our visitor education programs. We'd like to invite you to participate in a short video interview about your bear encounters and what you learned from them. This video would be used in our visitor centers and online resources to help educate future park visitors about bear safety and wildlife respect. If you're interested, please let me know, and we can discuss the details further. Best. Regards, Ranger Sarah." Emily looked up from the phone, her eyes shining with excitement. "Jake, this is amazing. Can you believe it?" Jake grinned, clearly thrilled by the opportunity. "I can, actually. We made quite an impression on them, and our story could really help other visitors stay safe." They spent the next hour crafting a response to Ranger Sarah, expressing their enthusiasm for the project and their continued commitment to wildlife conservation. As they worked, Emily couldn't help but marvel at how much their lives had changed in just a few short weeks. "You know," she said, leaning back in her chair, "when we were planning this trip, I never imagined we'd end up as bear safety advocates." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Life's funny that way, isn't it? One moment you're running from a bear, the next you're teaching others how to coexist with them." As the evening wore on, Emily finished her blog post and hit publish. Almost immediately, comments began to pour in from friends and fellow outdoor enthusiasts, praising their bravery and asking for more details about their experience. One comment in particular caught Emily's eye. It was from a local conservation group. "What an incredible story. We'd love to have you speak at our next meeting about your experience and the importance of wildlife conservation. Would you be interested?" Emily showed the comment to Jake, who nodded enthusiastically. "We should definitely do it. Remember how we talked about getting more involved in conservation efforts? This could be a great start." As they prepared for bed that night, Emily found herself drawn to the window. The Seattle skyline glittered in the distance, a far cry from the wild landscapes of Yellowstone. Yet somehow she felt more connected to nature than ever before. She thought about the scars on her arm, small scratches from their hasty retreat on that first night, now faded but still visible. They were the only tangible reminders of their bear encounters, but the emotional and psychological impact ran much deeper. Jake came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Emily leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. "I was just thinking about how much our trip changed us. It's like we left a part of ourselves in Yellowstone, but we also brought a piece of it back with us." Jake nodded, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I know what you mean. I catch myself being more aware of our impact on the environment, even here in the city. It's like Yellowstone opened our eyes to our place in the natural world." They stood there for a while, looking out at the city but seeing beyond it to the wild places they had experienced. The fear they had felt during their bear encounters had transformed into a deep respect for wildlife and a commitment to conservation. "We should start planning our next trip," Emily said suddenly. "Maybe Glacier National Park or Olympic." Jake laughed softly. "Already? I thought after Yellowstone. You might want a nice, relaxing beach vacation." Emily turned in his arms, her eyes sparkling with adventure. "Are you kidding? After what we've been through, I feel like we can handle anything. Besides, we've got all this new knowledge and experience. We should put it to good use." As they climbed into bed, their conversation drifted to future adventures, conservation projects they wanted to get involved with, and ways they could share their newfound passion for wildlife with others. Emily's last thoughts before drifting off to sleep were of Yellowstone, the majestic landscapes, the thrill of hiking in bear country, and the profound sense of connection she had felt with the natural world. The memories of their bear encounters, once terrifying, now filled her with a sense of awe and respect. In the darkness of their bedroom, far from the wild spaces of Yellowstone, Emily and Jake had found a new purpose. Their adventure had not ended with their return to Seattle. Rather, it had sparked a lifelong journey of learning, respect, and advocacy for the wild places and creatures they had come to cherish. As sleep finally claimed them, the distant call of a wolf echoed in their dreams, a reminder of the wild heart that now beat within their own.